This meeting is being recorded.
Do you know if she's...
She is there, I can see her.
She's there. Amina, can you hear me? Okay.
Hi, apologies. Dodgy internet connection, I'm afraid.
Perfect. Yeah. We're still trying to really get used to this new technology. Yeah. All right. Okay, the floor is yours. Over to you, Amina.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to be using the OctoCube, so I'm going to try to see if it works, but hopefully if it doesn't work, next slide, please. I can't see my slides on the screen. I don't know if that's... Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Amina Abu Bakr. I'm the Commercial Director for the Rivers Trust, and I'm going to tell you today about mainstreaming nature-based solutions in the context of a more resilient water environment. So there's compelling evidence, next slide please, that the global climate and the natural environment are facing a state of emergency, and we know this will continue to change for the foreseeable future. So we can expect to see the impact of those changes across all our natural systems. But as Professor Dasgupta points out in his review of economics of biodiversity, we're part of nature, not separate from it. The very resilience of these natural systems is synonymous to our own human and economic resilience. Slide, please. These challenges are also felt across our water environment, which continues to face growing pressures around too much, too little, or too dirty water, to the detriment of our communities, our economy, and our wildlife. And next slide, please. And although we are starting to get the message, which is obviously reflected in things like the government's 25-year environment plan, where the ambition is to leave nature in a better state across the UK within a generation, we're still in many ways playing catch up. With the rapid decline we experience in our natural systems, it means that more than ever, we need to mobilize urgent action on a much larger scale than we've seen so far if we are to reverse this decline. But of course, this means that considerable investment will be needed in the next few years to protect our natural environment and make it more resilient for the future. However, the gap in investment needed at the moment is quite considerable. According to a recently published report, that gap in the UK alone sits at about £5.6 billion per year. So how can we address these challenges in a more transformative way? And next slide, please. Nature-based solutions can help us to tackle these challenges. These are ecosystem-based approaches, and they're defined in many ways. For example, the International Union for Conservation of Nature defines them as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal changes, such as climate change, in an effective and adaptive way, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Most of my focus today will be on talking about nature-based solutions in the context of improving and enhancing the water environment specifically. And in that context, nature-based solutions provides an umbrella term for a range of activities, including source water protection, catchment and natural flood management, all the way to land management in the agricultural sector, and also things like green infrastructure, such as sustainable drainage systems and many other solutions. And although nature has a tried and tested approach to some of these solutions, in terms of our human and engineered activities, they actually still feel quite new and not as well established as built infrastructure. And often, this is because traditional natural solutions alone are insufficient to meet some of our needs, particularly in the water sector, which is heavily regulated. So I really like the World Bank's inclusion of hybrid solutions under nature-based solutions, as is shown on that slide, which integrates and enhances the benefits of natural and built solutions, bringing together the best of both worlds. And a good example of these hybrid solutions include things like the sustainable drainage systems themselves, permeable pavements, and even things like constructed wetlands, green roofs, etc. Next slide, please. And many of these approaches, like integrated water resources management and sustainable urban drainage systems, are well established. They're not necessarily new, and they have been able to demonstrate their capacity to tackle issues such as deteriorated water quality, flooding, drought, and water insecurity. Furthermore, the potential for nature-based solutions to make the water environment more resilient is maximized when the context, the uncertainty, and the natural variability that you expect from nature-based solutions is accounted for and integrated in design and planning criteria. When multiple stakeholders with varying interests and contributions across the water environment are engaged and included in decision-making. When a systems approach is taken to maximize that value of nature-based solutions in terms of their multiple functionalities, but also their integration and hybridization with the built environment. And when their value is maximized, nature-based solutions can provide a wealth of co-benefits in addition to water resilience, including sustaining livelihoods, improving food security, carbon sequestration, protecting biodiversity, and things like increasing the recreational value of urban spaces, in connecting people to nature, and contributing to water equity. And another important thing about nature-based solutions, around their multiple benefits, this could be synonymous to multiple funding opportunities as well. But we're still facing a lot of barriers with large-scale implementation and indeed large-scale investment around nature-based solutions, particularly within the water sector's ability to scale up implementation and investment. So more needs to be done around addressing these barriers. Next slide, please. As part of our strategic partnership between the Rivers Trust and water companies, particularly with United Utilities, next slide, please. We're starting to work together with various water companies, NGOs, and regulators to understand what those barriers are and what can we do to overcome them. We're currently working on developing a joint proposal, taking up our joined up experience as practitioners of nature-based solutions, and look to enable and influence more of the systems and catchment-based approaches to really maximize the value of nature in making the water environment more resilient. Next slide, please. So there's plenty of barriers when you look at this in terms of the water sector and large-scale implementation of nature-based solutions. So we're honing in on 4 or 5 of these barriers because we think these are the ones that can be overcome in the next 5 to 10 years to really accelerate that adoption and mainstreaming of nature-based solutions. So there are things around limited standardization of nature-based solutions and the approaches to assessing, delivering, verifying, and reporting on their effectiveness. Lack of cost-effective monitoring and limited robust data and evidence that's driven through that monitoring process. The need for a more balanced regulatory regime for nature-based solutions. In many ways, they're still permitted and addressed as engineered solutions or end of pipe. So that needs to offer flexibility to ensure that these approaches are actually fit for purpose. And there's limited incentives for the beneficiaries of ecosystem services provided by nature, the buyers and sellers of these ecosystem services, to really come together and catalyze the scale of implementation we need to see. And finally, when we talk about the gap in financing nature, there's an undeveloped market structure in the UK for nature, and a lot of these benefits are still going undersold and undervalued. And all of these challenges work together to widen the perception that nature-based solutions are high-risk alternatives to tried and tested engineered technologies, despite technological lock-in and constraining resilience in the long term. And nature-based solutions can provide different ways to deliver improvements to the water environment, and as such, they do require these approaches that support their implementation and adoption. And addressing these barriers requires action to build understanding, capacity, and drive uptake by addressing issues around cost, risk sharing, and timescales. Next slide, please. So what are we doing around these barriers? We're putting together a number of recommendations around creating and accelerating standardization, validation, and verification, using things like value frameworks that enable to look at the multiple benefits and value those benefits that are delivered by nature-based approaches. We also want to create a better evidence base to their effectiveness. So we're looking to test and co-create with many water companies and various partners a catchment monitoring cooperative, basically a monitoring framework to how we're going to do a monitoring a catchment scale using communities and citizen science approaches, but linking that to real-time monitoring and decision support tools, and sharing that more broadly and creating standardization around that data management. We're working with the regulators and the water sector to look at fit-for-purpose regulatory framework for nature-based solutions, really looking at things like flexible permitting approaches, innovative permitting to enable greater adoption of nature-based solutions, but also looking at building a value-based approach to economically assess nature-based solutions that goes beyond cost savings to deliver greater value for the customers of water companies, but also for society at large and for a more resilient water environment. We're looking to incentivize and create models that engage buyers and sellers, the beneficiaries of ecosystem services, with market-led approaches, with integrated planning, so that we can start to see that delivery at scale. And finally, we're looking to adopt a framework that can help to establish high integrity markets and build investable pipelines of projects across the country. And that framework has recently been proposed by the Finance Nature UK Coalition in a report recently published for government on recommendations on how to establish that framework for markets, to which the River Trust collaborated. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at with this piece of work is to create a national program of work to deliver transformative change for our water environment through steer, coherence and alignment at that national scale. We want to build and accelerate momentum. We want to test and learn by doing and use things like adaptive planning to assess, refine, reiterate, improve. And we want to build scale and we want to accelerate momentum. The water companies are about to go into their next business plan period, PR24. And what we want to see is over the next 5 years, going into their next business plan period, PR29, we want to see that transformational change, that transition from pilot scale purgatory all the way to business as usual and mainstream nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. And really, through this program of work, what we're looking to do is build that phased approach, the phased approach between now and 2030. So quite short timescales where we consider the scale of the challenge ahead of us. Next slide, please. But this is needed if we're going to deliver a more resilient water environment for the future. We want to create a value framework for nature-based solutions that's based on integration and prioritization at planning scale, joined up funding and investment, and large-scale delivery and adaptive stewardship. And more importantly, we want a value chain for nature that is about systems approach, added value rather than just cost savings, and one that builds that long-term resilience to large-scale delivery. Next slide, please. Because we know nature doesn't do piecemeal. It performs best when its ecological networks and the multiple benefits it provides are integrated and balanced. And we need to consider this when we look at investment opportunities so that we can build this value chain for nature. For example, how does surface water management and flood resilience, what do they have in common with things like recreational value of rivers and resilient society and economy? In the context of nature, these things are all interconnected, upstream and downstream of our water systems. So we really must avoid these silo decisions that we're still seeing, which are falling short of driving the scale of recovery we need to deliver. We have to look at our catchments and integrated systems and promote nature-based solutions that drive the best value for water, nature, and people. And by connecting the dots across the value chain of nature, we can help to accelerate action, amplify best practice, and work together to help mainstream nature-based solutions so they can play a key role in giving us the resilience for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amina. So we're now taking questions until the panel discussion. Our next speaker is Rob Rogers. Rob is the Director of Operations from the Bronze Authority And Rob is going to, Rob's talk has a very short but very eye-catching title, A Jewel in the Crown. So I'm sure that all of us are really interested in hearing or finding where the jewel is. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Normally, I get rolled out for the afternoon session, so it's nice to see you all awake. Well, thank you very much to Joe. Thank you for inviting me today to talk to you. My name is Rob Rogers. I'm the director of the Broads Authority, and I look after operations, a varied directorate, responsible for construction, maintenance, and ecology at the Broads, as well as ranger services and safety of visitors to the national park. Next slide, please. You'll have to forgive me. Many people I talk to have no idea what the Broads Authority is or what the Broads are, so I'll just give you a quick potted history. I can see some familiar faces in the audience, so it's not going to be too much for too many people. Climate change is a massive challenge, not just for us, but for all. My immediate task is to try and condense 10 years of lake restoration into a 15-minute presentation, so I've done my best. Please make good use of the Q&A panel afterwards, and my contact details are within the pack. So if you want any questions or anything afterwards, then please contact me. The Broads Executive Area covers 303 square kilometres, so in terms of protected landscapes, it's quite small. We have approximately 126 miles of navigational waters in there, 63 broads or shallow lakes, 7 rivers, the Yare, the Waveney, the Wensum, the Ant, the Bure, the Chet and the Thurn. And we have 1 estuary at Braden near Great Yarmouth. If you go back in time, around about the 12th century, peat digging was a fairly major industry in the East Norfolk, and most of the area was cleared of trees, and the shallow diggings commenced to take the peat for fuel and for building material. Historical records show that this continued for 200 years, but by then the diggings had filled the water and it made it very difficult to extract the peat. Round about the 14th century, peat digging had stopped. So we had a good 200 years of digging, and then it ceased. An important name within the Broads history is Joyce Lambert. She was born in London in 1916, but actually she studied in Norfolk and was brought up in Brundall. She was encouraged by Ted Ellis, a well-known name within the history of the Broads, to study the ecology in the fens bordering the Yare at Surlingham and Rockland. Joyce was able to show through her works that the Broads were actually man-made. Now, this actually went against a book which was released earlier in 1953 by a chap called Joyce, and he said that the Broads were naturally forming, and Joyce came out and said, no, they're not. What she was able to show was that the lake sides were vertical and that the parishes used to have turbary rights to actually extract the peat. And even today, these boundaries that the turbary rights went with for the parishes still remain. And in the Broads Executive Area, we have 96 parishes touch upon our borders, but not one single parish is contained within the park. By 1988, the Broads Authority was formed. We have 3 main purposes. We conserve, enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the Broads, promote opportunities for understanding and enjoyment of the special qualities of the Broads to the public, and protecting and enhancing navigation. Next slide, please. So to the body of my presentation, a map. Brilliant. I called it a jewel in the crown, but actually I could make a case for all 63 shallow lakes within the Broads. So maybe you need to agree that actually it's a jewel, one of the many jewels in the crown. This slide shows a hydrographic survey of Hickling Broad. To explain some of the colours, the reds and orange around the edge denote very shallow water, and the blue is deeper water. Now, when I say deeper water, 1.4 meters, so let's not get carried away. It is a shallow lake system. It is the largest Broad, 154 hectares, open water, and it forms part of the Upper Thurn system. 1,159 hectares of adjacent land is classed as triple SI. It is also a special area for conservation, a Broad special protection area, and a Ramsar site. So Hickling is actually adorned with special protection measures. And the challenges facing Hickling are considerable. In a minute, you'll see another slide, not yet, but it shows a 1945 picture taken by the RAF, and that's a whole different presentation, but not for today. But what we were able to identify from these pictures was that reed swamp regression had taken place on a large scale, particularly at Hickling. This is due to the highly erosive nature, wind and tide, and also predation by geese. They nibble away at the reeds, the land, and just erodes. This regression leads to very shallow water, silting up the Broad and shuts out light and damages the aquatic plant system. Hickling has a few aquatic plants. In fact, it has 41 species which are protected under the Natural Environment in Rural Communities Act. I'll reel them off because they're great. Hollyleaf naiad, Baltic stonewort, intermediate stonewort, convergent stonewort, starry stonewort, bristly stonewort, fragile stonewort, and there's also hedgehog stonewort, bristle stonewort, fragile stonewort, rough stonewort, and the lesser bearded stonewort. Now, as you can see, stoneworts are fairly predominant in Hickling, but what is actually important is that many of these species can only be found in Hickling. It's also very important for fish and pike particularly. And if you are a pike angler, no one? If you are a pike angler, you are highly secretive of where you catch your fish. And the largest pike, 44 pounds, was caught somewhere near Hickling. Hickling is brackish, which also gives it a few other problems. One of them is a very rare, naturally forming, but very rare Primnesium parvum, which is an algae. In itself, it's just a floating green mess on the water. But sometimes, and we don't know now why, and it's been looked at actually and studied quite hard now, but we don't know why it goes in a toxic bloom, and it kills fish on an absolute biblical scale. In fact, we've got records going back to the 1800s which show these toxic blooms and multiple fish deaths. So with the designations, shallowing water, increased turbidity, rare aquatic plants and Primnesium, the challenges faced at this site were actually immense, if not a little bit daunting. We needed to do something as the system was slowly choking up with sediment. Next slide, please. Next slide. Is it a person or is it a computer? Is it? 1945 picture of Hickling Broad. Long story behind it, but the RAF, thank you. Using these maps, and you can see we drew all over them, we were able to actually plan what we needed to do. We could identify the main areas of erosion, and you can see that at F and G. And also we understood where overwintering birds primarily stay, which is the hatched areas at H, you can see on the map. We then started to engage with local users, local residents and landowners. So this is a very active Broad. It has at the top end, around about A and B, there is a resident population. And there is also a sailing club and windsurfing, which takes place on this Broad. And it is a highly sought after location for sailing. We soon realized that actually to restore this lake was way beyond the budgets that the Broads Authority had available. So we had to start looking for alternative funding. And when we were still in Europe, we were lucky enough to come across the Canopay, which is creating a new approach to peatland ecosystems. This is a £5 million scheme, which we are a partner of. Other partners in that scheme include Belgium, French, Germans, and Denmark. Canopay had three main objectives. Recreating wildlife margins by reusing local sediment, conservation management materials, which reed cutting and sedge leave behind. We wanted to find a reuse for them, a market, if you were. And also we were looking to trial in the creation of charcoal products from conservation waste. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm only going to concentrate on one of those things, which is the recreating wildlife margins. Next slide, please. So the what did we do? Well, placing heavy structures in an amorphous peat and clay is actually fraught with engineering problems because everything just sinks, just literally without a trace. So working with an engineering firm from the Netherlands, we developed the stuffed sock approach. That's not an engineering term, that literally is what we did. and it aptly describes what actually happened. Using large geotextiles, large enough that you could drive a family car through, we sank these into the bottom of the Broad, and the slide there, the actual photograph shows you the tubes staked in place with alder pole. Due to the turbidity and the shallowness of the water, we actually had to do this by hand. So it fell to the trainee, unfortunately. Sorry, Adam. These tubes were then pumped full of loose sediment from Hickling. About 6,000 cube was pumped in. And we had to be very careful at this stage, because although we paid a lot of money for these tubes, because they were guaranteed not to burst, if you overfill them, which is quite easy to do, they can literally pop, and then you'd have all that sediment floating around in the Broad, which was clearly not the idea. The other problem that we had is that we needed to fill these at different levels, because the Broad isn't flat, inconveniently. And also the idea was that once they were filled, we needed them to be overtopped by the tide, because we want to grow plants on top of these, and the plants that grow need to have their feet in water. So we can't have them high and dry. So these all stacked up against us. Next slide, please. So this is an aerial photograph of the actual lagoon that we built. And this has been an ongoing project. I don't want you to think that we spent 10 years doing this. We didn't. This was quite a big chunk of our work, but there have been other projects that I haven't had time to explain to you. But what this photograph does show you is the dredging rig at the top to give you some scale. It also shows you the Gantt chart we used, very simplistic. But because of Primnesium, we had to be very, very careful about when we actually worked in the water body at Hickling. What we do know about Primnesium is that it tends not to go into bloom when the water temperatures are below 8 degrees, and also when dissolved oxygen is quite high. The only time you really get those two conditions in Hickling is in the winter. And winter is not a great time to be doing engineering works. Short days, difficult weather. Our lagoon had to allow for open pockets of water for habitat creation. So species like to have rough edges. They like to have small, exclusive little ponds. So they were built in. And also you notice the area behind the lagoon was left clear because Cara is very strong in that particular area of water behind that lagoon itself. Next slide, please. Good morning to Mary Pierre, fellow director. I put this slide in because I wanted to show you that, and it's the old adage, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. Bear in mind, this is a SSSI, a Ramsar site, SAC, designated up to, and there I am putting mud everywhere. It's not great, but this is what we had to do to actually to build this up. The slide actually shows the material being dredged and plonked straight on top of the geotextile bags. This is very important. What we need to grow on there is reed and typha. As I explained earlier, this is a brackish water. So the reed itself, we had to collect seeds from the surrounding reed bed and cultivate them in a local nursery, because we needed reed and typha that was actually sensitive, not sensitive to salt. So that is now being planted. Next slide, please. At this point, probably just good if I just acknowledge Mike Page. So he's the one who does the aerial photography, not just for me. It'd be nice, but not just for me. But he does create books, and there are a number of books showing Norfolk and Suffolk from a bird's eye view. But he flies over, takes these pictures of our works, and we're very grateful. So thank you, Mike. What this slide clearly shows is the channel running through the middle. You can see the sort of the brown stain, as it were. This is an unnaturally deep channel, 1.4 meters. Very few plants grow in that channel because the water is too deep, and boat movements, because it's for access up and down the Broad, churn the water up. But you can also see the lagoon glowing white. That's just because there's a lot of clay in the actual material, and that is now drying. But clearly you can also see the frontage of the lagoon. That's where we actually had the construction equipment. So that shows that the water all stirred up, sediment flowing around. But that's not the point. The point of this picture is the darker areas around the outside. What that shows is deep water. We've removed the fluid sediments that were choking up this part of the Broad, and we've surveyed these areas. And what we're seeing is, and those dark patches are testament to that, is the re-emergence of the rare stoneworts and other aquatic plants. So even in a few short months, because this was taken in May, even in a few short months, this is actually starting to work. Next slide, please. Well, thank you. I leave you with a slight cheat. So the first picture is actually how we found Hickling before we started work. So that's nothing. We built the lagoon. The bottom picture is an artist's impression. This is what we're aiming for. That will eventually colonize with reed and typha, and plants will grow. We need the right plants to grow, and we'll be monitoring over the next year or two to make sure that happens. But thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob. So our next speaker is Richard Cooper. Richard is a lecturer in catchment science here at UEA, and Richard is going to tell us something about integrated constructed wetlands. And I also know that Richard also does a lot of work with Alter, so he knows a lot about Alter and the dam engineers, and I'm not sure if you are going to talk about them as well today. Okay.
So hi everybody. Next slide, please. He's gone to sleep. Oh. There we go. Right, yeah, so good morning everyone. So I'm going to give you essentially kind of a case study of nature-based solutions in action. And I'm going to be presenting some research that I've been involved in the last few years, along with some excellent former project students of mine, who I'm pleased to see some of are in the room today. And we've really been trying to answer this question of whether constructed wetlands can be an effective nature-based solution for wastewater treatment. And most of what I'm going to talk about relates to their effectiveness in removing nutrients, but there are bigger questions here about what other pollutants could they remove from wastewater effluent, and how do they fit into sort of water company plans going forward in terms of a more sustainable way of treating effluent. Okay, next slide, please. So just a bit of background context really of why we're looking at wetlands. Why are we looking at these as an alternative form of treatment? Now, I'm sure most of you in here and online are familiar with the typical stages of sewage effluent treatment, where you have some form of primary treatment, some settling to remove particulate material and your fats and your oils. Secondary treatment, some biological oxidation to get rid of your organics. And then some tertiary treatment to remove, typically to remove the nutrients, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and so on. And so by the time that effluent gets discharged to the river, if you have all those elements and they're working well, typically the effluent isn't too harmful and it doesn't cause too much of an issue. However, we know that is not always the case. We don't always have those elements. Next slide, please. So there are a number of problems with conventional treatment, which we're pretty familiar with by now. A lot of the smaller wastewater treatment works, those unregulated works, don't have any form of tertiary treatment. So they don't have any form of nutrient stripping on them because it's simply not cost effective to put in expensive tertiary treatment for a works that's serving a few hundred or maybe just a few thousand people. And therefore it's not uncommon to see super high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus coming out of these small works. And I give an example there of some of the works that I've been working on, where you might see phosphorus up to 20 milligrams of P per litre and nitrogen up to 100 milligrams per litre. So really damagingly high concentrations. So we've got a problem there and we need to do something about that. We also have an issue with combined sewer overflows, something that's really risen up the political agenda in the last sort of 18 months or so. This system where during heavy rainfall events, you can discharge either raw or partially treated wastewater into the river to prevent backlog and flooding of the system during heavy rainfall events. Now that's a problem. It causes a problem for those small streams if they're going in on a regular basis. So potentially there's an opportunity there to mitigate some of this with constructed wetlands. And thinking further ahead, and some of the talks we heard about yesterday under future climate change predictions, it's quite likely that the intensity of summer rainfall events will increase. If we're having more heavy, more intense summer rainfall, potentially we might end up with more activation of those sewer overflows, more release of raw sewage effluent. So potentially there is this opportunity there to deal with that. There are then wider implications in terms of sort of economic arguments. Wastewater treatment works are very expensive, they're very energy intensive to run for all the pumping and the aeration equipment. Annual carbon emissions from the water industry in the UK as a whole, around 2.4 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And we heard yesterday, didn't we, about this water company target, water industry target of net zero by 2030. So how are we going to meet that? How are we going to mitigate that carbon that's being released? And again, potentially constructed wetlands could be part of that solution. Next slide, please. So what are constructed wetlands? In essence, they are a series of ponds, of cells constructed and planted up with a range of aquatic plants, to which you then put through your sewage effluent. And they work, in essence, as a biofilter. So these plants and the microbes and the periphyton and the algae that you've got growing in there will be absorbing that excess nutrients and filtering that out. You'd also have natural, chemical, and physical processes going on to strip out that excess nutrients. So it's an alternative to the more physical and mechanical mechanisms that you would have in a conventional sewage treatment works. If they're designed well, they could potentially be more sort of environmentally sustainable and robust and largely self-managing. So there's this overarching question really we want to answer, can they be this cost-effective, low carbon and more climate resilient mechanism for sewage treatment? Next slide, please. So part of the work that I've been involved in, as I say, with some of my excellent students in the past, is actually looking at a couple of case studies of these treatment wetlands and just seeing how well they are performing. And one of those is on the River Mun, up on the North Norfolk coast. So this is a wetland constructed by Norfolk Rivers Trust, downstream of a Anglian Water Treatment Works. And it's a fairly small system, so it covers just under 3,000 square meters, 3 interlinked cells which are planted up with native aquatic plants. And that was built towards the end of 2014 when that came online. And as I say, it's downstream of a fairly small works of Anglian Water, so it only serves around 700 people, that particular works. So the volumes of effluent coming in are pretty small, but the concentrations of nutrients are very, very high because the treatment level within the works is pretty basic because it's an unregulated works. Next slide. And so what we went out and done is went and took samples from across this wetland over a number of months through 2019, sampling at the top and bottom of each cell, as well as upstream and downstream in the river, and measuring the concentrations of the nitrate, the phosphate, and looking at the discharge and the flow rates through that system, so we could see how it is performing in reality. Next slide, please. And here are some of the results that we found. So this slide here showing performance in terms of phosphate removal during that particular year. And the key headline message really is in the top left there, where we saw a 64% reduction in the phosphorus concentrations between the top and the bottom of that wetland. So really, really good performance at removing excess phosphorus. The loading as well, total load in terms of kilograms of phosphorus per day, reduced by about 58%. So clearly working very well as this biofilter, removing that nutrient. It's worth saying that the concentration of phosphorus coming out of that wetland was still at just over 3 milligrams of phosphorus per litre, which is super, super high and would be really, really bad for the ecology of that stream. So you wouldn't see any immediate improvement within the river channel itself, but hopefully further down the catchment, when you get extra dilution, then you should start to see improvements. And that's why, I mean, at the bottom there, you can see the concentrations in the river downstream of the wetland are still elevated, but not elevated to the extent they would have been before the wetland was put in. Next slide, please. And we see very much the same pattern with nitrate. So nitrogen removal performance was very, very good. 62% reduction here in the mean nitrate concentrations, 56% reduction in nitrate loading. So again, it's removing that excess nutrients in the way that we're hoping to see. Next slide, please. So that was an example of sort of a slightly more established wetland. And then there is the larger, more, I suppose you call flagship wetland of Anglian Water and Norfolk Rivers Trust up on the River Ingle. And this is a larger wetland covering almost 11,000 square meters, consisting of 4 interlinked cells in this case, again planted up with native aquatic plants. And this facility became operational in spring 2018. Now this wetland receives effluent from a much larger treatment works. So over 6,000 people served by that Inglesthorpe treatment works there. So the flows of effluent coming in are much higher, but the nutrient concentrations are much lower because the treatment within the facility itself is to a much higher standard. So there's not as much N&P going in to begin with. Next slide, please. And we've done very much the same thing. So through 2019, sampling at various points to that wetland, top and bottom each cell, upstream, downstream in the river, measuring the nutrients, but also we looked at the carbon here because we're interested in building a carbon budget for these particular wetlands. Next slide, please. So here are some of our results for that particular wetland. So here for the phosphate, and we can see here that the overall reduction in phosphorus concentration was substantially less than we saw in that River Mun wetland, only around 27% reduction in mean phosphate concentrations. And we believe that's probably because the wetland during this year of monitoring wasn't as well established. It was in its first year of operation, so the plant and the microbial communities really hadn't got established and weren't operating at their full capacity. So we're seeing potentially reduced performance as a result of that, which is useful to know in terms of when you're putting these in, how long is it going to take until they get up to maximum operational performance. We see the loading there actually was pretty high in terms of the reduction, around almost 70% reduction in load. The reason for that was because actually the flows coming out of the wetland were quite significantly lower than coming in, because during the period that we were monitoring, during the sort of late summer, sort of mid-summer as well, there was a lot of evapotranspiration from the open surface water, so there wasn't as much water leaving the system. But you can see at the bottom there, impacts on the river still pretty high. So we see a sizable uptick in the phosphorus concentrations downstream of the wetland, but again, not as high as it would be had that wetland not been in place. Next slide, please. It's very much the same picture for the nitrogen. So we see here around a 34% reduction in mean nitrate concentrations. So again, substantially lower than the River Mun one, but hopefully as those plants and microbial communities establish, that performance level will increase. Next slide, please. And at this particular wetlands, as I said, we looked at carbon, and we're interested to start building carbon budgets for these wetlands and seeing how they can perform in terms of potentially sort of carbon mitigation and helping in meeting these net zero carbon targets. And we looked particularly at dissolved organic carbon and looking at the fluxes through this wetland. And what we found actually wasn't a great deal of change in the dissolved organic carbon concentrations between sort of the top and the bottom of these wetlands. A minor uptick of around sort of 9%, potentially as a result of the plants that are in there leaching some dissolved organic carbon into the water. So not a huge change at this stage in its development. Okay, next slide, please. And this is all forming part of what we hope will be a more complete understanding of the whole budget for these wetlands. So measuring all the inflows of your carbon, of your nitrogen, your phosphorus. I have a PhD student at the moment who's looking at microplastics and looking at whether these wetlands can remove and store microplastics. We've been monitoring what's coming out, but there's other questions really about what's stored within the wetland itself, what's stored within the wetland sediments. We've done a bit of a back of the envelope calculation in terms of the amount of organic carbon stored within the sediments of this wetland up at the Ingle, came up with a value of around 26,000 kilograms during that first year of operation. But we know wetlands can be a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to look at how much CO2, how much methane, how much nitrous oxide is being released from these wetlands. And is there any downward movement of nutrients or carbon? Is there any connection with the groundwater? Are we losing material downwards? So we hope to build up a more complete picture as we move forward. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's the economic side of things, and we heard a lot yesterday about the economics behind water company plans and so on. And so, if these are to work, they need to be cost effective. You can have the best mitigation in the world, but if it's super expensive, no one's going to do it. So, we've looked at the cost of building these and what it works out as a cost per person served by the wetland. And you can see in this example here for these two wetlands, looking at around 30 to 40 pounds per person for that sort of one-off installation, assuming no ongoing maintenance and so on, just as a construction cost. So fairly cheap, I would say, compared to, for example, putting in tertiary treatment technology at a smaller work. So potentially economically viable, which is what we want to see. Next slide, please. And as we move forward, we've got ideas around monitoring different types of pollutants. So particular pollutants of concern, like flame retardants, contraceptives, those are kind of endocrine disruptors, all the kind of things that are coming out of sewage treatment works. What role can these wetlands play in mitigating those other forms of pollution? And I'd be very interested to hear from those of you that are in the water industry, if you've got particular contaminants of concern that are, the regulator is pressing you on, that you would be interested to find out whether these wetlands can tackle, whether there's something we can do there to take that forward and research that. But I'll leave that there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the very interesting talk. So our next speaker is Dave Tickner. Dave is the Chief Advisor for Freshwater at WWF. I think Dave is joining us online. Dave, are you there?
I am, yeah. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dave. Yes, can hear you.
Great, good. The technology is working.
So I think, Dave, you are going to give us a talk more on the nature-based solutions on a more global scale. So we're steering away from the local, regional scales and over to more global scale. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thanks to the previous speakers. Much of what I say, I think, will chime with what you've heard this morning, even if it comes from a more international perspective. Now, is it possible to show my slides? Marvelous. I guess, in essence, what I'd like to do this morning is just make the case that nature-based solutions offer tremendous opportunities for us, I think, to address simultaneously the climate crisis and some of its effects, water management challenges, challenges around nature and biodiversity and other things besides. But we will only be able to grasp those opportunities if we think a little differently. We go beyond business as usual in terms of conservation, in terms of land and water management. Next slide, please. First of all, a little bit of context, and then I'll talk about some particular work we've done in this space. Two things here, really. Firstly, as well as the climate crisis, the world is really facing a nature crisis, and this is increasingly in the news. Conservationists often use the term of bending the curve of biodiversity loss. We see tremendous downward trajectories in biodiversity globally and locally, nowhere more so than in freshwater ecosystems, in rivers, lakes and wetlands. WWF's Living Planet Index, which, if you like, is a sort of stock market index of what's happening to wildlife in rivers, lakes and wetlands, shows an 84% decline from a 1970 baseline. That's more than twice the decline we see on land or in the oceans. And nowhere is this biodiversity crisis more acute than in freshwater ecosystems. The good news is we kind of know the solutions to this. A couple of years ago, I led a team of international conservation scientists and policy experts to develop what we called an emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. It was a 6-point plan. I won't go into the details now, but the important thing was that all of the recommendations in that plan, they've already been implemented somewhere in the world. We have proof of concept. The challenge is very much one of scaling up. In addition, we are also thinking in WWF increasingly of what we call the triple challenge. So we want to restore biodiversity across land, freshwater ecosystems, and in the oceans, globally and locally. How do we do that when we also need to use land, use waters for people's needs? And increasingly, we need to use land and water to mitigate climate change, to sequester carbon from the air. Is it possible in any given context that you could use land and water to achieve all three of those objectives? Or are there going to be trade-offs involved? Are there going to be times when perhaps we can't sequester so much carbon because we want to restore biodiversity or we want to grow food for people, for example? So that's sort of a grand context, if you like, of a lot of the work that we do in WWF. The question for me then is, where do nature-based solutions fit into that context? And what I'd like to do is reflect on that, drawing on 3 pieces of work in different parts of the world. So if I could have the next slide, please. I suppose, firstly, this piece of work that I'll focus on, it was really a piece of work looking at nature-based solutions, or the potential for nature-based solutions to address climate and water risks in African contexts. And the key point I wanted to make to start with here is that if you look at the definitions of nature-based solutions, including the IUCN definition that Amina talked about earlier, they emphasize usually that nature-based solutions have to actually solve something. They have to solve a societal problem of some sort. And I think there's just a little bit of a danger in, at least in conservation circles, that we use nature-based solutions really just as a bit of a tagline. We sort of rebadge standard conservation and say, well, it helps people in a general sense. But I think if nature-based solutions are to really be taken seriously and to be upscaled, then we need to start not from a conservation standpoint, but from a socioeconomic standpoint. So what we wanted to do with this piece of work was actually explore the published evidence of whether nature-based solutions actually do address climate and water challenges in African contexts. Standard way to do that is through a systematic review. We used a quick scoping review methodology led by Mike Akerman of the Center for Ecology and Hydrology. And from our search protocol, we initially found 10,000 papers which talked in some way about nature-based solutions and water issues in Africa. When we scrutinized those a little more closely, we found just 150 that presented hard evidence, if you like, quantified evidence, drawing on 492 case studies of African contexts and the use of nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. And just to give a flavor of the kind of challenges that we were exploring, the kind of challenges that we thought nature-based solutions might help to solve in the context of this study. We looked at water quality risks, and I think water quality and water scarcity, the middle map here, they're interesting issues in that, although they're obviously very important, and those of us working on water management often have them front of mind, when it comes to decision makers in public policy or the private sector, often they will acknowledge these as issues, but they're not top of the agenda. Whereas issues like economic growth, GDP, for example, are top of the agenda. And so we wanted to sort of characterize these kinds of risks, not as risks in themselves, but in terms of what they meant to decision makers' priorities. It was very interesting when we ran some separate analysis on this across Africa. It's something like 25% of people live in areas which are exposed to moderate or high risks to GDP from water quality or from water scarcity. Flooding, obviously very important and can be top of politicians' agendas and business makers, business leaders' agendas at points of time. There's about, I think it's 20 of 25 of Africa's 25 biggest cities potentially exposed to serious flood risks. So again, these are serious societal challenges. Next slide, please. What did we find from our evidence review? Well, first of all, we characterized nature-based solutions in terms of forests, floodplain and upland wetlands, constructed wetlands, and urban interventions, very much the kind of things that Richard, Amina, and Rob have talked about, just in an African context. And what we found from our evidence review is that there's pretty consistent evidence from published science that nature-based solutions such as forests, floodplain wetlands in particular, can play a role in improving water quality. Perhaps not a big surprise given the presentation we've heard this morning. There's also pretty consistent evidence that they can help to reduce flood risk. The evidence on whether they can sustain downstream river flows and as such help to assure bulk water supplies for cities, farmers, for example, that's rather more mixed. It's quite complex, it's very context specific, and it's very difficult to generalize about whether nature-based solutions really can play a role in addressing water scarcity. Nevertheless, we also found that given the socioeconomic significance of scaling up some of these nature-based solutions in an African context, and given the stated investment priorities of major financial institutions, people like the African Development Bank, World Bank and others, there's potential for very significant investment in nature-based solutions across Africa. There's a strong role potentially for the private sector there as well, and much of this work was supported through a partnership we have with AB InBev, which is one of the world's largest brewing companies. There are some caveats to this. Of course, we're constrained by the evidence base, and the evidence base is patching. Repeat, only 150 papers across the whole of Africa looking at nature-based solutions. That's not a particularly strong evidence base, I'd say. And obviously, in terms of actually implementing specific nature-based solutions, that needs to be very locally driven. The analysis we produced was at the continental scale. It gives us a broad picture. So it's a foundation to work from. Next slide, please. Moving on. I suppose the second part of thinking beyond business as usual is, at least in my field of expertise, I think this is the case across water management generally, there's often a focus, particularly around sort of conservation issues, on specific projects. Now, don't get me wrong, thinking about individual projects and trying things out through projects is useful and necessary. But if we really want to capitalize on the billions of dollars of investment that might be available for nature-based solutions globally, we have to look beyond individual projects, and we have to start trying to mainstream nature-based solutions within broader water resource management plans and strategies. Amina talked about this in her presentation in the UK context. How can we do that in a practical sense? Over the last 10 years, WWF has been working with China's water ministry, in particular an agency called GIWP. I won't bore you with what that stands for. GIWP is essentially the main strategic planning arm of China's water ministry. And the senior people there are charged with thinking about how China can resolve its water problems. And China has some pretty significant water problems. Very major pollution problems driven by its breakneck economic expansion in recent decades. Major water scarcity problems, particularly in the north of the country. The map here shows relative water scarcity north to south. Very big flooding problems. Still in China, thousands of people die every year from flooding. And China's approach to resolving these is usually being driven by big engineering. Three Gorges Dam is in the picture there. China is actually a nation of water engineers. Its first governance mechanisms thousands of years ago came about because people needed to work together to manage floods and water scarcity. And it has a history of appointing water engineers to be its leaders. Hu Jintao, who was the previous leader of China, was a water engineer. So our work with GIWP has really focused on strategic water management. As I say, it's been running for a decade. The outputs have been published in a series of books, which you can see there. And I thought I'd just give you highlights of a book which is in press at the moment, which is really focusing on sustainable approaches to water infrastructure. And when we talk about water infrastructure here, we're talking about both built and natural infrastructure. And we're talking about designing new infrastructure, considering how to make the best of existing infrastructure, and potentially removing infrastructure where it's very damaging. Quite broad in scope. Next slide, please. We began by conceptualizing water infrastructure, and this is, I guess, similar to one of the diagrams Amina showed earlier, subtly different in that rather than putting natural infrastructure and built infrastructure in different boxes and then saying they need to work together, we actually conceptualize water infrastructure on a continuum. So even the greenest nature-based solutions are likely to need some engineering in order to channel the benefits, or at least to test the results. And many grey infrastructures, many built infrastructure assets have scope for being a little bit greener if we think about them in the right way. There are some perhaps which are what we might call dark infrastructure, where it's very difficult to envisage any environmental benefits. Those might be the ones that we think about removing from the system if the benefits they provide are outweighed by the environmental and social costs. So that continuum of water infrastructure has really sort of coloured our thinking in all this work. And I think it's quite a useful concept to take forward as we think about nature-based solutions. How do we build portfolios of infrastructure at large scale, so river basin or catchment scales, that combine perhaps some grey infrastructure that already exists that we could green a little bit around the edges, but also some real sort of really effective nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. Now, the book that's in press at the moment, I've just finished editing a draft of it. It's 300 pages long at the moment. It will hopefully be a little bit shorter when we publish it. I don't have time to go into it in detail here. But a couple of things to show you. One is about barriers to uptake of nature-based solutions. We still see a number of barriers, some of which are about standards, some of which are about the different performance that you get from nature-based solutions, from wetlands and forests. Forests take a long time to mature. They may not actually deliver full benefits for years or decades ahead, in comparison, for example, to a water treatment plant, which could be built in a relatively short space of time and be operational immediately. So there's a time scale barrier that needs to be addressed, for example. There's also a bias to build barrier. Still within water management, there is, in many parts of the world, an instinctive reaction that if there's a problem, we need to build something out of concrete to try and address it. And that's fostered through engineering training programs, for example. So we need to think quite deeply about how to address things like bias to build and temporal aspects. Next slide, please. And then we thought we would bring all of this together. And I should say this is all built on sort of case study analysis from various parts of the world, as well as expert workshops in currently a 5-year process to bring all of this together. We thought it would be helpful to bring all of our thinking together into what we call a framework for strategic planning. And basically this framework is built around a bunch of questions, which you see on the left-hand side of this diagram, quite sort of a logical flow of questions. I guess the key thing I wanted to point out here is that half the questions are really about understanding the context in which you're working. And then half of them are actually about planning some kind of blended infrastructure response. Without understanding your context, both the biophysical and socio-economic, the cultural dimensions of that, the governance context, and thinking about this at the system scale, at the catchment or basin scale, upstream and downstream linkages between in-stream and floodplain processes, and so on. Unless you really understand that context thoroughly, it's going to be very difficult to build strategies which really capitalize on nature-based solutions. So again, we have to go beyond individual projects if we're really going to make the most of the opportunity. Next slide, please. So I guess the last thing I really wanted to talk about was thinking about nature-based solutions, not just from a water perspective. Within conservation circles, within natural resource management circles, I think we're often guilty of operating in silos. In WWF, for example, to be candid, we have lots of people who think about freshwater and lots of people who think about forests and lots of people who think about oceans. Just occasionally we talk to each other and we realize we have some similarities, there are lessons we can learn from each other, but also there are some things we don't understand. We don't necessarily understand how changing forest management might affect the rivers, or changing river management might affect the oceans, for example. So built on, and actually this is some work we're doing here in the UK, and this is very early days. I'll present here is very embryonic. It's really, we're trying to develop some kind of research framework that can help us understand how to address some of those triple challenge issues that I mentioned earlier across land, rivers or freshwater, if you like, and sea, at a landscape scale in places like East Anglia, for example, where we do a lot of work in partnership with Rivers Trust and others. And so in draft form, we think the research priorities are really, first of all, around understanding those ecosystem interactions. If you press a button on land, what reaction does that have in the river? And how does that knock on to the sea? We think there's probably more to understand about that on the fundamental science level. And next one, please. And then really taking that scientific understanding and making it available through scenario tools, decision support tools that can help decision makers operating across what we sometimes call in slightly jargonistic way, wholescapes, linking land and sea with rivers often as the conduit in between, in order to help those decision makers consider potential portfolios of interventions that can help address the triple challenge, climate, nature, and people's needs. Those portfolios should include nature-based solutions in many contexts, but they might also include other things as well. Next one, please. Of course, all of that is fine technically, but fundamentally, this is a governance challenge. It's a socio-economic and political challenge. So it's really important to understand how often fragmented natural resource governance platforms and frameworks can be aligned or brought together or streamlined in some way in order to ensure that decision-making processes are equitable, that we have just transitions, and so on. Next one, please. And of course, all of that is fine, but if you don't have any money, you can't do anything. We know that there are a range of different potentially novel financing opportunities for nature-based solutions through government funding, through private sector funding, potentially through other sources of funding as well. How do you bring those together at the portfolio scale in a blended way? That's another research priority. Moving on. And then, of course, we need to figure out if all of this works. We need to monitor, and track and learn as we're going. And so how do you do that in a way that's lean and efficient, that doesn't take too long, that gives you the information you need, but which is also scientifically robust. And finally, the world is changing very rapidly and in unpredictable ways. Whatever kind of portfolios we put in place for nature-based solutions and other measures, they need to be future-proofed and resilient as far as possible. So how do we go about thinking about this? And what are the kind of tools that we can use to help us consider future scenarios and consider how to design individual projects for nature-based solutions or whole strategies which are flexible in the face of future uncertainty. So as I say, that's a sort of a broad research framework that we're playing with at the moment. It's quite high level. There's scope for lots of work, specific work underneath that. I'd be very interested to hear people's thoughts on it. So I think I'll finish there. Thanks for listening.
All right, so can I invite Rob and Richard to come and sit at the front? And we have two online speakers. Amina, is Amina still there? Okay, perfect. Amina, I can see you now. So we have Amina, Dave join us online. I was really pleased to see the comments coming in even during the presentation time. Although I was surprised that I was told actually the chat was disabled. Apparently it wasn't. But anyway, we're learning as we're using this new technology. I hope it didn't disturb anybody. But it was really great actually to see the comments coming in. Okay, perfect. All right, so should we start with the online questions first, Colette? Okay.
Yes, we've got a few online. Maybe if I just do the first two and then we'll give a chance to the room. The first is a comment. So I'll just give a chance for speakers to respond if they wish. So Amy Prendergast from the Environment Agency says that the small sewage works are regulated and have permits. They either have descriptive targets or numeric limits on the permits. So I suspect that was a comment after your talk, Richard. Don't know, do you want to respond to that? I don't think there's a need to. But
Amy knows this better than I do. So.
Yeah, fine. And then we have a question from Becky Baines. She says, I'm interested to understand how the agricultural runoff affects all of the statistics and the barriers and solutions that agriculture causes from a NMP basis. How can we work with farmers? Richard, yeah.
So for context, I've done our presentation on constructed wetlands, but I was involved in a big research project for 10 years working with farmers on this very thing, on how to reduce the impact of agriculture on freshwater resources and aquatic ecology. In terms of sort of overall, where's this stuff coming from? In general, if we're talking on a sort of a Norfolk perspective, agriculture tends to be more of an issue with the nitrogen, with the nitrates, where we have a lot more leaching and groundwater movement, whereas phosphorus tends to be more of an issue coming from wastewater treatment works. But in the research that we've done and what other groups have done around the UK, there's really good evidence of actions farmers can do to reduce their impact. So things such as winter cover cropping is really super useful to reduce the amount of nitrate leaching that you're getting. Conservation tillage, so not ploughing the soil, leaving it undisturbed, so you don't destabilize the soil structure and increase the amount of soil erosion. There's things we've done in combination with the Rivers Trust in the past and WWF around Silt traps, putting silt traps on country roads to capture mud that's washing off these narrow country lanes. We have a lot of agricultural movement in and out of fields and so on. So there's a range of measures that are out there and we know exist, and it's good to see an increasing number of farmers around the catchment, particularly locally, are now employing them. If you want to add anything?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. We at the Broadside do, although the area is actually quite small, so 303 square kilometres, but the catchment for the Broads is 10 times that size. So we are heavily affected by farmland and runoff. And all those things that Richard spoke about, we've worked with farmers. And I think the thing to remember about farmers is that they spend a lot of time and money keeping their soil in good condition. So they don't really want to lose it. So these measures are quite simple. We've helped with, in fact, Tesco's did a great piece of work and bought some materials and machinery that farmers can use to actually break up plough lines and capture more water on their land. So I think there is a lot being done with the farmers. I think they do get a little bit of a hammering, but actually they are guardians of the landscape and do a great deal of good work.
I wonder if Amina or Dave, would you like to add anything to it?
You might need to use some microphone.
Okay.
There.
No,
You do, don't want you will make some. And then when you'll sit with them.
I just want to ask if Amina and Dave, you want to add anything?
Yes, I'll just add to that it makes business sense as well for farmers to have these more sustainable measures and in terms of their land management, which is good for them, for their business, for water and for the environment. So it is, how do we demonstrate that to farmers that it's good, it makes business sense as well, which is something they understand. And the Rivers Trust certainly do a lot of work with building farm plans and do facilitation groups with farmers around nutrient management, around catchment-based approach as well. So there's a lot in there that isn't just about the direct impact on the environment. It's showing to farmers that actually is good for them. And as the two speakers were talking about, retaining nutrients and etc., and really not losing a lot of their soil is good for them as well.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I very much echo that, you know, the answer to a lot of these problems, and there's a question later on in the chat box about groundwater protection from agricultural runoff, which I think is linked to this. You know, a lot of the solutions are linked to good farming practice rather than, you know, a separate nature-based solutions approach. But the two can work together. So if you can improve farming practice so that farmers don't lose their soil and don't leach N and P, then that will help. Sometimes some loss is inevitable, in which case things like silt traps and other nature-based solutions could be helpful. I guess specifically in terms of groundwater, the thing we always have to bear in mind is the geology, the underlying geology. So in designing interventions like silt traps, for example, we just need to make sure that we're not enabling or continuing the transference of nitrogen in particular into groundwater systems. So that is one of it's a nice tangible example of something I was saying about really understanding the system that you're working in. You might need slightly different approaches in a very porous geological area, for example, from those you use in one where the underlying bedrock is less pervious.
Okay, thank you. So can we now move on to the audience here sitting in the room? Would you like to? Okay.
Hi there, Phoebe from the UEA. I just wanted to thank you for all your really fantastic presentations. I just wanted to touch on what David said about build to bias. And I wanted to ask the panel what you think you would suggest to kind of help overcome this challenge and maybe help shift mindsets from working against nature to working with nature. For example, getting engineers to be more involved in nature-based solution concepts and building and designing that. And I just wanted to hear what you think, because we could have a lot of finance available for nature-based solutions, but I fear if our mindsets aren't quite there yet, it could really become a barrier to the whole upscaling of nature-based solutions. So, thank you.
It was mainly to Dave, wasn't it?
The whole, and yeah, it was in regards to the advice, but anyone.
Shall I have a first stab? Yeah, it's not an easy challenge to address. One of the things I would love to see is a bit of a rethink on how we train both environmentalists and engineers. I think we're very good in many parts of the world at training people technically. So there's a lot of very good technical engineering training master's programs, for example, a lot of very good technical conservation master's programs. I think we're less good at teaching people to think strategically about how to address some of the big challenges facing the world. And when I say strategically, I mean that's really sort of thinking about multidisciplinary approaches, about skills around stakeholder engagement, around designing portfolios of interventions rather than simply focusing on projects, those kinds of things about accessing innovative finance. So I would love to see training programs which bring together engineers and environmentalists to think about those sort of strategic aspects of addressing the world's challenges. That wouldn't be a panacea in and of itself, but it might help.
I think it's a good question. For me, we live in a wonderful world where actually engineering can do anything. The question I often get asked by my board members is, can you? And I always say, yes. How much do you want to spend? But I think actually we need to go back to basics and actually look at much simpler methods. So actually, I mean, if you take the population as a whole, we all have gardens. There's something we can all do to retain water. Stop paving over your drives. Very, very simple things. So I think the drive always seems to be with these sort of conferences, we always look at the big picture. Actually, we need to break it down to tiny little pictures and actually look at what individuals can do. That would be my thing. And I think that's the thing that I speak a lot about, is breaking it down to very simple terms.
Can I add to that? I think that's absolutely right, Rob. It's the learn by doing approach. We need to kind of start to understand what's going on the ground, because there's organizations such as yourselves and NGOs and others that are doing this day in and day out. They're delivering solutions already. The problem we have, particularly from the water sector perspective, is uncertainty, and the uncertainty that is just the inherent nature of nature-based solutions adds to risk, and risk adds to costs. So, and there's a direct flow of that. And engineers like certainty, and they like to make sure that they're hitting outputs and they're hitting the regulatory requirements that the industry needs to hit. So compliance is it's a really important risk to manage. So it's how do we start to learn by breaking down those sort of examples on the ground? How do we start to build the scale from the ground up? How do we take an asset management approach to nature-based solutions? And I think it's a really interesting concept that we're keen to explore with the water sector in the next few years, because that's what will add to some of that engineering certainty and remove some of the bias and sort of start to shift mindsets, because you're doing it, you're seeing that certainty, and hopefully that creates a more positive vicious cycle.
Okay, I think I saw a hand up over there. And Mark, did you raise your hand as well? Okay, Bruce as well. Oh, Bruce, okay. I think we did. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Catherine Farr from WaterAid. So obviously working abroad, I know a lot of the examples from this panel, these were fantastic presentations, largely focused on England. So I'm going to ask two questions. One, how flexible are these solutions, especially Richard, your work, when we know that populations will increase and things will change, and that we might need to then therefore be able to change the wetlands. So interested in sort of, do you just build another pool and then it's fine, or sort of how can we make sure this is going to meet future needs? And then the second question is, we know there are lots of issues around maladaptation, and that some nature-based solutions work in some locations and not others. And so really interested to know, particularly around this tertiary NBS solution for wastewater, how we can use that. Can we use that in other countries? Is this something that we can use in Africa? Is it something that's specific to certain types of geographies, and kind of how we can really feel confident in promoting these NBS solutions internationally? Thanks.
So the fundamental principle behind it is very, very basic. You know, it's nothing, in reality, it's nothing new. You know, people have been using wetlands to treat water for hundreds of years. It's perfectly transferable to other countries. You'd have different plant types potentially that are suitable in different climates. But we have to recognize there's a limitation in terms of scale. I mean, they work best really on those smaller treatment works where you haven't got a huge amount of flow coming in. Therefore, you don't have to treat a large amount of material in a given space. So, you know, if you were to put a wetland, say, on the major treatment works at Whitlingham, downstream of Norwich, you'd need, you know, half of South Norfolk to be able to treat that amount of water. So there is a limit into the size of the population that can be served. But, you know, when you go around the catchment, you often find that some of the biggest problems are caused by those small little facilities where perhaps the water isn't treated to such a higher degree, and water is discharging into very small little streams where there's very little flow at all. In some places around the region, you'd have the treatment works itself is the source of the river, and there you can actually make big gains. And that would be the same in other countries as well. Perhaps we have small communities where they have no treatment at the moment, where a wetland could get put in fairly cheaply, fairly easily. It doesn't require a great deal of technical knowledge compared to, say, conventional treatment technologies. So I think it is transferable. You just have to work within the limitation of scale of population you could serve.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, so maybe we should move on to the next question. So Bruce, hands up. So we are already past 30, and I guess we'll take one more question from the audience here, and then we have questions from the online participants. We'll take one from there.
Okay, mine's probably more of a comment, but allow me to expand on an idea which I've sort of come to while listening to this. I like Dave's caution around whether NBS is applicable in all places. And there's a trick that I think has been pulled on us this morning, which I want to describe to you if I can, which is that essentially what we've all done with this morning is that we've seen nature-based solutions through a temperate global north, relatively equilibrium, predictable, humid environment in which the problem is rivers and groundwater. And there's a hydrology of rivers and groundwater, and nature-based solutions in terms of attenuation of floods or improving water quality is clearly a very good solution. But in many parts of the world, semi-arid, global south, closed river basins, it's not that rivers and groundwater don't exist, it's that the problem is water scarcity and water allocation. And in that, irrigation is depleting 70 to 80 to 90% of the water. It's 2% in the UK, irrigation. These are enormous paradigmatic changes between rivers and groundwater in the global north and water scarcity and water allocation in the south. And water allocation, when you've got irrigation in the picture, is really about control and apportionment and conveyance and about timing and about flow control. And I think for that, nature-based solutions will have some part to play, but I think we should be extremely cautious about how we overclaim the utility of nature-based solutions in places where communities are desperately short of water and where they believe the community upstream is depleting their water through consumptive practices such as irrigation. And so that's my sort of claim, which is that we've got to be, well, my claim, my concern is that we've got to be very careful about the nature of the problem into which nature-based solutions are being tailored and are being applied. Thank you. It's just a comment, really.
Dave, do you want to add anything?
Not particularly. I agree with Bruce, which isn't always the case, but in this instance, yeah, I agree with him. Often, specifically around water scarcity, the problem is overuse of water. If you want to address that, you have to look at use of water, and nature-based solutions might just only be scratching at the edges. It's not to say they can't play some role in assuring what water supplies there are, but they're not necessarily the panacea.
We have a question at the back. Where is it? Saw someone's hand up. Is there any more question from the audience?
We use some online ones because I think there's at least.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've got several online.
All right. So is it a short question or you're okay? Okay. Thank you. So let's move on to the online.
Yeah, so I've got one that's for Rob, but I think would be something that might be interesting for our other panelists to comment in relation to their own work. So there's Kelvin Allen asked or says, thanks Rob for the talk on the Broads and its history. In terms of the theme of the conference, I'm struggling with the linkage in the Hickling restoration and nature-based solutions with the climate critical theme. As David just stated, does it address the wider climate and water resource challenge? Like many other lake restoration schemes in the Broads, none address the consequences of rising sea levels and water resources now upon us, apart from some limited carbon management. So I'm wondering if you could comment, Rob, but perhaps also other speakers would like to comment more on the climate angle in relation to that.
Yes, well, thank you, Kelvin. That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly one of the biggest threats to the Broads is going to be the rising sea level. And we're already seeing certainly large incursions of salt water up the system. And often I get asked, well, dredging will be the answer to that question. Well, it isn't. The more you dredge, the more salt you actually allow up the system. So it's interesting, Kelvin, sort of draw the conclusion that the Hickling isn't a nature-based solution. It actually is a nature-based solution to the fact that we've got a very rare aquatic plants growing in Hickling, which need protecting. As I said, some of those plants don't grow anywhere else in the world apart from Hickling, so they deserve their time and they are very important to the habitat. Kelvin's a big angler, so he certainly should appreciate the efforts we've gone to keep the pike there, if nothing else.
Amina or Dave, do you have anything to add to that? Or
Not from me.
that's okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Do we have another quick
We've got
question?
we've got one hands up.
Okay.
If we've got time to take that one.
Yeah.
So it's Bruce Hewitt online has his hand up.
Hi there. Thank you very, very much for those presentations. I'm interested in whether any of you could comment on the problems of cost-benefit analysis when you're looking at nature-based solutions, because the advantages, some of the advantages are in relationship to social issues, health issues, that kind of thing. So it's not just financial cost-benefit analysis.
Richard, do you have anything you want to comment on with regard to the integrated wetlands in terms of?
I suppose I've got a bigger response, really, that we have a problem in general that everything is assessed by GDP and everything's assessed on the economic benefit, and some of the more potentially promising schemes from an environmental point of view wouldn't get through because they're not economically suitable. So there is issues there. In terms of, say, the work that's I mentioned before we've done with working with farmers, a key part of that was really demonstrating the types of things that they could do that would also have a positive impact on farm businesses. So a key thing within encouraging a greater number of farmers to take up, say, winter cover cropping to reduce nitrogen leaching into the groundwater was to demonstrate to them that there is an economic benefit the following year in terms of increased crop yields when they've had a cover crop the previous winter. So yeah, certainly quantifying all of the economic benefits from the environmental, the social are super important if you're going to get these types of schemes delivered.
I think I'd like to just close now because we are really overrunning. And I can see that from the faces here that you really need a power break, coffee break. Okay, so we'll close here and then we'll have the next session at 11 o'clock. Okay. Thank you very much for all the speakers. This plug in here, yeah.
Okay, I don't know if it's necessary.
Right, so I might make a start. So welcome back, everybody. And my name's Jo Gear, for anyone who's joined today but wasn't with us yesterday. I'm the Director of the Water Security Research Centre at UEA. And I'm very happy to present our last but in no way least session for the conference on water and health. We are very fortunate to have an excellent lineup of speakers, starting with Professor Jamie Bartram, who will be introducing this session. So a little bit about Jamie. Between 2009 and 2019, Jamie led the creation of the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina, establishing an unprecedented water and health research hub that drove policy, programming and practice worldwide. He also led activities at the World Health Organization for 10 years, particularly water and wash activities, not the whole organization itself. But he's also done very many other things. It would take me quite a long time to go through them all. So they're just some key relevant aspects of his career that I wanted to mention today. So with that, I would like to hand over to Jamie.
Thanks, Jo. I'm never quite sure what to make when people begin with last but by no means least, because it feels like they mean least, but we can't really actually say that. That'd be rude, wouldn't it? So, but thanks for the history. And when you started to say there's other things I could tell you about him, I was getting really worried, a bit panicked about what was going to be revealed. So that's, I feel quite safe now. Yeah? So what my reflections on the excellent presentations we've had over today and yesterday is that we've got this remorseless message that there's action needed, and we should get on and make sure that we take efficient and effective action. And in a few cases, there's this hint that decision making has been slow and we really need to accelerate. So when I chose the title, this, What's the Use of Science? I really meant it literally. How do we use science to make change? The kind of changes that Jeff referred to yesterday as effective, efficient, and equitable. Now, there's a very widespread meme that's probably most of us here will have seen. I'm not quite sure how this works, so I press the button there. Oh, something's happening, that's good. Right, of a science policy gap, or a valley of death, if you want to be rather more dramatic. And in that, we caricature scientists as incapable of conveying timely evidence or avoiding caveats that strip their evidence of any actionable meaning. And we create parodies of decision makers that have got attention spans of perhaps 1.5 pages of banal generalization or one election cycle. And those stereotypes and parodies worry me because they're unhelpful. They obscure real people, actually people like us, who want to make a difference. They want to contribute to beneficial outcomes and help respond to critical issues, the very things we're talking about in this event. So what I'd like to do today, in contrast to that focus of an image of failure, a gap, I want to focus on what we've learned about what works in science application. And what I'll do is present some fairly well understood science and then back up that with examples from my own experience. And Jo, as you described, experience as an academic, trying to influence policy and practice, but also as a decision maker, desperately trying to get scientists to give me the stuff I can use. Those examples include, for example, speakers are terrible people, aren't they? They include water safety plans. Now, water safety plans are an idea, an approach that was unheard of before 2004, and within 10 years was being applied in 93 countries in every region of the world. Some of those countries, it was already at national scale. 46 countries already had policy or regulatory instruments in place, and another 23 had them in development. Now that, I think, is an outstanding pace of adoption of an intervention. And you can compare it with the bench to bedside uptake of evidence-based practices in medicine, which takes typically around 17 years. So we're looking for urgency, and the system that we're trying to drive with evidence is one that normally reacts quite slowly. That water safety plan approach was unquestionably evidence-driven and science-led. I know, because it began with an open question: how could we manage water safety better? So a second example, again from my time at WHO, comes from developing and updating its environment and health norms. Things like the guidelines for drinking water quality. They are hugely influential. They determine regulations everywhere from low-income countries through to European Union directives. And while they're evidence-based, they're not science-led. So the role of science is codified and it's programmed. The rules for sifting evidence are laid out in public. You can read them. Engagements with the science, policy, practice communities is systematic and organized. So the guidelines reflect a policy process that's laying out its evidence needs and seeking science to engage with it. Another contrasting example is from the world of international policy. We've heard a lot here already about the Sustainable Development Goals, the negotiation of which was systematic. There was a process laid out, but that process changed and evolved extensively and repeatedly over time. Science was just one factor among many that was jostling for influence in terms of what came out. I can point to one example of a real effort to try and influence using science, which was through an opinion article that was published just before negotiation or talking about the SDGs began, which identified 7 water and health themes that should be reflected in the outcome documents. And that led into 18 pieces of published research. And each one of those dripped into policy processes, negotiations at a time when the lack or the insufficiency of evidence was being talked about in their particular area. Now, I can't demonstrate that those individual papers, alongside all the other efforts, determined or heavily influenced the outcomes. But what I do know is that they were picked up in critical discussions, they were noticed, and I do know that all 7 themes ended up in the outcome. So I think there is a reasonable likelihood that they helped along the way. And the final example I'll give for a minute comes from the world of programming rather than policy. So only a couple of years ago, a scientific report showed lead-rich materials in drinking water systems in multiple countries, and associated with that, lead in supplied water. In quite a small constituency, that created quite a furore. We don't think that giving children lead poisoning is a very good idea. What did it lead to? Well, very rapidly, there was an informal coalition that included several NGOs. One of them's in the room, but I better not name water. Oh, sorry. WHO, UNICEF, universities, and others. That coalition meets regularly. It's got a work plan, and the work plan is linked to specific commitments. So things are happening. Now, in that example, evidence was without doubt the trigger for something happening. And it was the fulcrum, it was the thing that people came together to discuss. But in actual fact, the detail of the evidence was very secondary. What mattered once the issue was on the table was negotiations about roles and functions, and especially communication. In that case, I think it was important that the evidence didn't point to any particular country or any particular implementing organization or even any particular supply type as the problem. And that contrasts with what we saw in Bangladesh not so many years ago, when the discovery of arsenic in drinking water led to a lot of finger pointing, a lot of accusation, a lot of energy spent on trying to identify blame and fault. So the key points of those first comments are firstly that science is successfully used in policy, in program development, and in professional good practices. And that can be science-led or application-led. But firstly, there are many other factors that influence decisions, so we need to place science correctly. And secondly, within the domain of water and health, this idea of science application receives very little attention. We don't study it, we don't try and understand it, and therefore we're weak in trying to better develop it. Now I can do my own slides apparently, here we go. So it's fortunate that we can learn from positive experiences elsewhere. So David Cash and colleagues and others who build on their work have studied successful science policy influence under the banner of boundary science. And they've come up with this rather neat abbreviation of CREAL. Credibility, which relates to being trusted, convincing, believable, is from the perspective of the decision maker. So why should a decision maker have confidence in evidence that they are being asked to act on? Relevance, or often called saliency, is perhaps the most obvious. I doubt anyone would be surprised to learn that evidence is more likely to be used if it becomes available just when it's needed. Glorious coincidence that we don't see very often. And legitimacy then concerns the quality norms of the research community. As scientists, why do we believe in a given piece of evidence? So if we use our water safety plan example, credibility was enhanced by repeatedly hearing and accommodating stakeholder perspectives, and those changed the outcome. There was substantive adaptation, and that was done through formal consultations, international conferences, and deliberate targeted engagement with some underrepresented stakeholder groups. Legitimacy was enhanced by a series of preparatory synthetic reviews. So what do we know? And later by articles co-authored by well-known authority figures, especially academics. And rather unfortunately, relevance was enhanced by some nasty, very high-profile waterborne disease outbreaks, often affecting high-income as well as low-income countries. So Milwaukee and Walkerton will be names of places that resonate for some of us in this room. Now, importantly, for what I want to say today, these three things, credibility, relevance, and legitimacy, are things that we can understand and we can act on. So, for example, a lot of credibility arises from early, consequential, and sustained engagement with stakeholders. In our water safety plan example again, that engagement process took 10 years. And one of the problems that creates for us is it rarely aligns well, this sustained engagement rarely aligns well with funding cycles, especially research funding cycles. Nevertheless, as individuals, engagement is something that we can decide to do, we can do better, or we can do more of. But it's challenging. It challenges scientists to involve decision makers as active influencers of research from the earliest stages, from question identification and method development, rather than treat them as targets for dissemination of information. And it challenges science users to think better about identifying and communicating their own evidence needs, something we heard about in this last session earlier today. At system level, an apparently simple step would be to ensure better training in effective engagement and effective communication. And because credibility is easily modified by the media, skills in interaction with media become really important. And it was nice to hear Dave referred to this idea of skill development for engagement as something that he also saw as critically important. Relevance then. Well, relevance tends to arise because of policy windows, influencing windows, things like the negotiation of new international development targets, or of a new EU directive that's relevant to our theme. Or it can arise from events, typically problem emergence. We've had recent dramatic experience of disease emergence, that's one example. Sometimes also emergence of unintended consequences of an intervention that need to be remediated. However, most applied science is reactive. It's reactive to those things, and evidence availability slowly follows funding and therefore is late to the decision-making table. Decisions have already been made. And that suggests to me that systematic forward thinking is an important part of improving the way that we do the science enterprise. As an example, one foresight exercise run by Karen Sethi surveyed a network of water and sanitation stakeholders just after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things she found was very low confidence and evidence demand on managing untreated wastewater and fecal sludge. So compared to the other themes that decision makers were being asked to respond to, those two were their big problems. One other observation that I think is worth bearing in mind is that research sophistication doesn't drive relevance and it doesn't drive credibility. I know that because among the examples, among the themes of that SDG influencing exercise, the theme of safety in healthcare facilities was accelerated in 2018 by a call to action by the UN Secretary General. And in that call to action, they unusually directly cited the work that we published to support that change. What was that work? It was done by a small group of undergraduate and master's students who simply compiled and generated simple descriptive statistics to say what a mess that system was. No one had thought to do those things previously. Sometimes, not always, very simple, compelling information can have important impacts. So at individual level, we can assist and we can work as scientists and as decision makers to identify those influencing windows and to learn about foresight exercises. We can think this through, we can develop the skills. But at system level, we have different problems. So for example, while health agencies, for example, health research funders, increasingly support science application and demand that it's covered in submissions for funding, what they receive is essentially dissemination of findings, late stage output of the findings of a piece of research, not engagement in the critical initial stages. And so on to legitimacy. Well, some of the weaknesses in evidence are things that we know very well, but challenge fundamentals like the sanctity of the peer-reviewed journal article as the building block of legitimate science. They're going to be hard to fix, and yet they're quite profound. We know that the peer-reviewed process is overloaded and imperfect. We saw the Lancet in the early stages of the COVID epidemic with an embarrassing retraction of a very influential paper on chloroquine treatment for COVID. And that's a high-profile example. I believe that many other examples are never retracted, never seen, never corrected, and that is harmful. We see skewing of evidence because journals are still reluctant to publish no effect findings. That's shameful. And while there have been moves to demand pre-registration of study trials, and medical journals claim that they require it, if you dig down into that, In practice, they do not. And in areas like environment and health, we have no equivalent call and no equivalent response. There's much we could do. There are other weaknesses that I think are more tractable. Our academic training today still creates scientists who are skilled in critiquing individual studies, but only relatively recently have we started to really foster the skills that enable the individual to bring together a body of evidence, organize it, describe it, understand its quality, and derive generalizable findings and implications. We could do much more of that. And in my own experience with systematic and scoping reviews, is that very few of the papers we end up including even include the information that would enable us to interpret the study quality or even the reporting quality. And that's something we can individually act on. We can do our work better. Now, these three things, these three success factors, CREAL, are necessary, but they're not sufficient for science application success. And that's true largely because science communication is actually quite difficult. Most individuals and most organizations work within discipline or subject boundaries. So we communicate with others who share similar vocabulary, sometimes values, even software platforms. In part, it's hindered by jargon, language. In this room, we've used lots of abbreviations that those of us here are comfortable with, and yet we need to talk to others who have no idea what they mean. And it's also hindered by preconceptions about our communication partners. The example I would give there is a convening of senior advisors from 6 sub-Saharan African governments to explore the perception that ministers of finance were not supportive of water and sanitation work. That was done by Clarissa Brocklehurst, and her report describes something quite contrary. What we found was ministers of finance who were keen to serve as custodians of the public purse, who really wanted evidence on value for money. They were craving objective comparison of the policy options. What's more, they were really exasperated, fed up with, quite angry about superficial reports with flat briefings that didn't give them detail, specificity, and precision. They were really fed up. I remember this because I remember some of the words that were being used, by weak monitoring and evaluation. So the scientists who are saying you're not looking at our monitoring and evaluation are hearing the ministers are saying your monitoring and evaluation is not good enough for me to act on. And interestingly, ministers who didn't like ad hoc one-off briefings but wanted timely, planned, systematic dialogue and interaction. Very different to the caricature that we tend to carry. Now, those same workers who gave us CREAL identify 3 functions that foster communication and ultimately science application: convening, translation, and mediation. So convening is about encouraging direct interaction among stakeholders, especially between scientists and decision makers. And we've learned that that enhances evidence use, even in an antagonistic setting, and that surprises people. And as individuals, we can look for opportunities to participate in convening, and we can encourage it. We see it sometimes in conferences. I'm not sure if this one counts as a convening in the sense of this term, because we are all here by choice with common interest. But we do see some conferences, and perhaps this one qualifies, where there is systematic intention to provide opportunities to bring together people who might not otherwise meet. Stockholm Water Week, the UNC Water and Health Conference are 2 examples where that's designed into the structure. But a lot of convening requires specific powers or capacities. So for example, many UN agencies will convene frequently. WHO will convene scientists to generate consensus. That would be the case, for example, in an initiative to give foresight on emerging issues in water and infectious disease. They do it to get insight, so they convene expert groups to advise them on their own work. And we see that in the context of SDG monitoring, for example. That's WHO and UNICEF working together. And they do intergovernmental convening. An example I know of is the series of European environmental health conferences. They led up to a formal protocol on water and health. And that protocol now brings together policymakers and scientists from different sectors to promote precisely evidence-based national target setting. So we see convening, assisting movement towards adoption of evidence-based approaches. One of the challenges with convening is that typically it will involve bringing together dissimilar stakeholders, and that means that power balance is important. And echoing something that came up in discussion yesterday, in practice, the voice of the presumed beneficiary population is very often weak or absent. Translation then is about mutual comprehension. It concerns, or it principally concerns, taking science and moving it into the vocabulary and the style of communication of other stakeholders. And what we have learned about effective translation is it has to be recipient focused, so it's specific to a target audience. It needs to use multiple channels and it needs to be sustained. Those are infrequent characteristics of most dissemination efforts that we see. Scientists, decision makers, typically are not good at translation. So it tends to be specialists. So for example, in the world of international development, it's often foreign consultants or foreign NGOs that translate and adapt international policy or guidelines for the national and local governments. Karen Setti's foresight exercise provides examples of some practical information that we can garner about translation. So among the decision makers that she surveyed, they valued highly when information was combined. So you had a brief document that allowed them to get the big picture, and that was backed up by a substantive technical explanation and data. That's useful to know. Secondly, people outside the science establishment are much more likely to perceive information sources as contradictory or unreliable. So we need to be better at conveying where there is scientific consensus. And interestingly, most of the respondents preferred multinational information sources. And she found very little demand for evidence from local universities in the settings of concern. I was surprised, but that's what we learned. Thirdly, then, mediation involves resolution of conflicts, stalemates, anything that the operating system is no longer supported. Oh, thank you. Can I just close that? Will that go away? I hope so. I'm just going to carry on and hope for the best. So mediation was where I was up to. So mediation is about actively resolving conflicts, things that that impede information flow. And it's especially important in value-driven politicized processes, such as those we see around climate change and sometimes water and health. One example comes from the Nukus Declaration from the Aral Sea Basin, signed by 5 heads of state. In that case, there were a group of individuals who went back and forwards between stakeholder groups over the course of one evening. And what they were doing was listening to each group and picking up, when is that a must-have? When's that a showstopper? And what are you saying that's something you'd quite like to see? And as that got taken over to other groups, they could then respond to that and say, well, we're never going to get away with that. We've got to move that down. And perhaps we could appeal to them a little bit by adding what they'd like to see. That worked. Other examples, that's a long, slow process, but mediation is important. All right, convening, translation, mediation, they all require specific powers or skills. So they tend to be things that are done by specialists. They all lean heavily on this understanding context. So things like mapping stakeholders is a really big deal. And again, they benefit from early and sustained engagement. And I think yesterday it was Peter who referred to collaboration now hinging on groups that we'd not had before. So this idea of understanding stakeholders and managing them is a really big deal. There are a few characteristics of water and health which create special challenges to these things. The first is that simply that decisions have to be made. They're urgent, they're unavoidable. But weak or debated evidence tends to delay decision making. So we have a problem. In that problem, scientists are confronted with a conundrum that they argue for action based on evidence that at the same time they're saying is insufficient or inadequate. And decision makers need to justify action without an evidence base that's clear. And that points again to the importance of evidence synthesis and consensus statements, especially those from leadership figures. Secondly, water and health is complex, as AJ emphasized yesterday, far more complex than the medical interventions where ideas like evidence-based medicine, systematic reviews were developed. So for example, the variability in outcomes, which we see as a weakness, is all too often the signal. We've heard today about what works, where, and when. Thirdly, water and health can be politically charged, value-driven, as I've already said. And we know that evidence has weak influence when ideologies, interests, and information align. And finally, again, because of that diversity of stakeholders and their imbalanced power. Our conference title reminds us that we are facing a critical decade. Responding to that challenge means improving science application. I believe there are things that we can each do now to multiply the effects of our efforts. And there are things that we can do to work towards system changes that will multiply those benefits further. They may be demanding, some of them may go against deeply ingrained ideas, but they are opportunities to seize. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. We'll move on and save questions for the end for the panel. So I'd like to introduce Paul Hunter while we have a swap over of the microphones. Paul is a professor of medicine in the Norwich Medical School. His key research interests include the epidemiology of emerging infectious disease, especially that linked to environmental factors, the spread of infection by drinking water, but also recreational water, contact and food, zoonotic diseases, risk assessment and risk communication, and in conducting research in the UK, Europe, and the developing world. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much for that, Jo. Okay. So okay, so I was asked to talk a little bit about water and disease in a warmer world and sort of what we can expect perhaps. And no, that's not working. Yeah. So I think the key message that I want to get across today is that actually the relationship between climate, water, and health is I was told my phone would work, but it's It's apparently my phone is muted.
Maybe just say next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, okay. It is very, next slide, very, next slide, very complicated. And that is both a challenge and possibly an opportunity. Next slide. Now, I think the first thing to say is that actually, what do we mean by waterborne disease? We sort of tend to think waterborne disease is you drink a glass of water with some shit in it, and you then a couple of days later get a bad dose of diarrhea. And that is often actually what happens, and it's what got me interested in drinking water, managing outbreaks of waterborne disease in my last job. And there are a vast array of really interesting and fascinating organisms that can make you quite sick through drinking water with them in it. And you know, the classic diseases such as typhoid and cholera, but also more modern diseases, cryptosporidiosis, norovirus, enterotoxigenic E. coli, Campylobacter, and then even other things that don't cause diarrhea, hepatitis E, infectious hepatitis, hepatitis A and E, and can cause diarrhea, can cause disease if you drink them in your tap water or your water that you've acquired from surface water sources. But also there are a wide range, and Jamie's already mentioned the issue in Bangladesh with arsenic poisoning, but there's also things like fluoride poisoning if you drink too much fluoride, which is a problem in some hotter parts of the world. And then there's water access problems. Okay, you can't actually get enough water to maintain all the things you need to use water for, because it's not only drinking it, we use it to wash ourselves, we use it to wash our water. And so the whole range of diseases that actually are associated, they don't actually poison you through drinking water, but if you don't have enough water, you can't practice good hygiene and you get these diseases. And you know, one of the classic examples is trachoma, which is an eye infection due to Chlamydia trachomatis, which is prevalent in many parts of the world. But also pneumonia, chest infections sometimes can be associated in areas where you don't have enough water to maintain basic hygiene. Dehydration, it's obvious. If you haven't got enough water, you get dehydrated. And if you get dehydrated, your cognitive abilities decrease. And this can be a particular issue in schools where children don't have enough access to water. And also injuries. You know, Joe and I and others done work on water, collecting water, and the problems that might have for people having to go and collect water and on their musculoskeletal system. And basically, one of the main conclusions is that whether you're a man or a woman, you can get injured during collecting water. Women tend to fall over and bash themselves. Men tend to get into fights and punch each other to get in their injuries. But you know, there's still injuries acquired during collecting water. Then there are water-based diseases. These are diseases that you actually get usually from having more immersion in water, but they're generally parasites that have an important stage in their life cycle. And you know, I used to have pictures on these until I realized that actually some of the pictures that I'm showing made some people feel quite ill, so I stopped showing them. But the classic example is schistosomiasis. This is a parasite schistosoma that spends some of its life cycle growing in freshwater snails. And it gets into the freshwater because people either poop or pee into the water. These Miracidia then hatch, go into the snails. They mature, they come out of the snails, and then if you get into the water, either while you're collecting water or playing in the water, or you're standing in the water or doing other things, they can then burrow into your skin. They then end up either in your bladder or in your rectum or in your bowel, where they engage in perpetual sex and generate huge amounts of eggs that then can repeat the cycle and dengue fever is another classic example of, not dengue fever, sorry, dracunculiasis is another classic example of that, and I'm sure you've seen the pictures of these worms coming out of people's legs that can be up to 1 meter or more long. Then there are water-related diseases, and these are diseases that usually insect vectors are important in terms of breeding in those water sources. And the classic example of that is malaria, but also a raft of other things, river blindness, and one of the diseases that I'm particularly interested in, dengue fever, is associated with water. And the dengue fever often is associated with clean water sources, where the water that are in containers in and around the home, rather than just sort of lakes and so on. And then there is problems with engineered systems, and Legionnaire's disease is a classic example of this. There are other mycobacteria that can cause problems there. And the question is, which of these different types of water associated problems can be associated with climate change? Next slide, please. And the fact is, they all can. If you have, if you have, if you have hot climate, then the water in the distribution network is warmer, and then bacteria can grow more rapidly in that system. If you have floods, and so on. Now, next slide, please. One of the earliest bits of evidence about climate change was we were focusing on waterborne outbreaks. Next slide, please. And this is some work done by colleagues of mine from what was the Public Health Laboratory Service, is now the Health Security Agency, looking at outbreaks of waterborne disease. Next slide. And you can see this shows that basically outbreaks tended to happen a day or two after there was heavy rainfall events. And this was one of the earliest big issues about concerns about climate change. If we're going to get more heavy rainfall events, we're going to get more outbreaks. Next slide, please. And actually what we found is that, yeah, in some months you get more outbreaks, but in other months, with droughts, you have less outbreaks. And so, next slide, please. And so, certainly in the UK, that actually overall, it wasn't actually increasing the likelihood of outbreaks that much. But there's no doubt that heavy rainfall events, flooding, is associated with a vast array of diseases, both drinking water related diseases such as cholera and hepatitis C, and also water associated diseases, malaria, dengue fever can follow flooding. Next slide, please. But it is a bit more complicated than that. And this is, next slide, please. This is a chart that we drew up for a paper that's actually no longer in press, it's being published, but looking at the relationship between climate change, cholera, and disease and wash systems. And I think the thing to get from this is that it's actually really complicated. I suspect very few of you can actually read anything on that slide, but that's the point, that it's just so many different interactions that we can't actually, it's difficult to get an adequate concept of all the different mechanisms that we can see. Next slide, please. But boiling down, some of it, flooding, they can get water and floods overflowing into boreholes. Next slide, please. Flooding out of latrines. Again, next slide. And damage to infrastructure. And all of those can lead to outbreaks and spread of disease. Next slide. And this is work that we did in Bangladesh after floods. And you can see here that, again, these flooding in Bangladesh led to subsequent big outbreak of cholera, which continued after the floods receded. Next slide. And you can get damage to distribution networks. This is a photograph from Puerto Rico, where after Hurricane Maria, next slide, please. And the big thing that I really want to finish on now is droughts and the problems of droughts, because I think droughts have been underestimated as a health risk. And the reason is simple. Floods are easy. You get a flood, you can get a team together, you can go out and you can do whatever you want, and then you can be home by Christmas. Floods, droughts go on for a very long time, and the health impacts of that change gradually. So often they are missed out. Next slide, please. And you can see here, this shows that in Africa, ultimately, although we get more floods and we get the risk of outbreaks of cholera is more in following droughts, is more likely and more severe because droughts go on for a very long time. Next slide. And then there's the whole issue about in droughts, population migration, conflict in cholera. Next slide, please. And I think probably that it's time to stop here now, talking about the problems of cholera in the Yemen and in part the conflict issues there that may in part at least be associated with problems with WASH. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. So our next speaker is Catherine Farr. She's the Senior Policy Analyst for International Climate Action at WaterAid. And so she's working to ensure that water and WASH considerations, particularly for the most vulnerable, are part of international climate action to ensure that we are able to sustainably and realistically meet our goals from the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda, which cross-sectorally heavily rely on resilient water sources and services. Catherine's work experience on water, climate and science policy and implementation includes the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, ARUP, the Global Water Forum, the US Department of State and the University of Oxford. She founded the Community of Women in Water in January 2019 to bring together women working on water issues from around the world. So thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Jo. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So just going to check something here. All right. Okay, I've already been introduced. It's really great to be here. It's also really great to see so many of you online. I think we've got over 45 people online and over 45 people in the room. It's really exciting to be able to do a hybrid conference. I'm really excited to be standing up here, but I have to say I've been really enjoying the conversations and all the learning I've been doing since yesterday, and I want to try to pull some of that information together in this presentation. We haven't talked as much about people and the way that climate impacts them, and maybe except for everything that Paul just said. But when we look at climate change, it's very easy to think about water holistically, concern for the oceans, and there's a lot of discussion in conversations with people about plastic. But a lot of times when I tell people that I work at WaterAid and I work on WASH and climate change, I get a bit of a blank face. Like, what does WASH have to do with climate change? So I want to talk a little bit about what WaterAid does, if it's not familiar with everyone who's here today. For the last 40 years, WaterAid has been working to transform lives by improving access to safe water, sanitation and hygiene, or WASH, in the world's poorest communities. And our work focuses on water for basic needs. We look at drinking water and water for washing and cooking, cleaning, hygiene, sanitation, and small-scale livelihoods. We don't just look at the household level, we also work on healthcare facilities and schools. We know that, as Paul was saying, and Jamie, that lack of good quality water is a major problem for a lot of communities. It's a major problem for healthcare facilities, and it can increase the risk of disease. One of the things that we want to understand better is how that impacts climate change, and what impacts climate change has on health and WASH services. We know that WASH is fundamental to underpinning the health and well-being of communities, and that we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. When we think about how WASH is impacted by climate change, there are 5 areas that we look at. Too much water, flooding; too little water, droughts, as Paul was talking about; dirty water, damage to infrastructure and services. Paul's slides are much better than mine for visuals there. And the negative impacts on health and well-being. But it's important to realize that the hazards are not felt the same by each individual that is impacted from each event. And so we need to look at the vulnerabilities and inequalities and the long-term stresses that each person can experience and how that changes their ability to respond to climate change. And so here's a list of the types of vulnerabilities we need to think about. There are gender inequalities, social exclusion, poor wash access, poor health, low finance, limited adaptive ability. And what's interesting is that the IPCC report that came out in February lists these compounding issues as adding to the challenge of both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And it talks about climate change as contributing to the spread of disease in humans and wildlife because temperatures are changing and those changing climates are altering where pathogens and animals carrying them live. This was this little equation here was, I think, alluded to in some of the other conversations that we've been having since yesterday. But climate risk is a combination of the hazards of climate that you're facing and your individual or your community's vulnerability. And that vulnerability is different for each individual. So if you think about that list of vulnerabilities on the previous slide, some people don't have access to wash. Some people also might be really poor. Some people might also have gender inequalities that they're facing, but not everybody is going to fit into the same category or have all the same tick marks. And so when you look at solutions for a community, you need to recognize the range of compounding inequalities that the community has and what solution is going to get the most people to have that reduced vulnerability and that really positive impact. Because we know that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. That's something we cannot forget when we look at this. And an example is that in situations where there's strong gender inequality, women find that their vulnerability is often higher than men with similar vulnerability, other vulnerabilities to the same climate hazard. We know that in 22 sub-Saharan countries, over 50% of the water collection activities are done by women when the households don't have piped water. So they may have to go further for water in a drought. They may not be able to get good quality water. They may be having to stand in those heat waves we saw in Pakistan and India recently and really have additional concerns around dehydration and heat stroke in trying to collect the water for their families. So going back to how WASH and health and climate change interact, we know that extreme and slow onset weather events and rising temperatures, all of which what we talk about when we talk about climate change, affect water and sanitation services and can cause outbreaks of cholera and all of the other diseases that Paul was just mentioning. For example, in developing countries, there's been research to show that the incidence of diarrhea is expected to increase by about 5% for every degree of warming. So when we talk about a 4-degree scenario, that's pretty intense. Without access to safe wash and sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene, people in rural areas and in cities are more exposed to and less able to cope with the impacts of climate change. I want to talk about how we've had more recognition about WASH. So this is something a lot of times when I talk to climate people, when I'm at COP26, people are just starting to realize, okay, we need to do adaptation, we need to do resilience. And they don't realize that the IPCC has been talking about WASH and the importance of WASH for climate resilience and adaptation since 2014. And they have listed it as one of the most effective measures to reduce vulnerability in the near term as a way to improve basic public health measures. So when we go back to Jamie's point about how decisions need to be made, we need to do things now. When we think about some of the other conversations around how do we have a low regret solution that we can implement now, WASH is actually one of the answers to that. I'm not going to pretend that it is the only solution that will be the silver bullet to solve all of the problems, but it's often not even being considered on the table, despite the fact that, again, in the most recent report, IPCC has said that it is a low regrets adaptation solution. So we need to be focusing on using this as a way to build resilience in communities to the climate impacts that we know are coming, especially those that are being the hardest hit. So how, Catherine, how does WASH build resilience to climate change? Well, let's look at water services. We know that one of the ways is if we have a sustainable WASH service, and we know that people can count on clean water in times of need, that they're going to be more resilient. They're not going to be spending extra time taking care of family members who've become sick because there's been an outbreak. They're not going to take children out of school because they need to go further to collect water. You can do more because you've got a reliable water source. We talked yesterday about the importance of water storage as a buffer in times of scarcity. We know that rainfall will be changing when that rainfall happens. Even if you have the same amount of rainfall in the year, it's not going to come when we need it to come. We need to know that we've got water when we need it. And then water treatment is going to remove those harmful pathogens and contaminants. And so that's really necessary as well. How WASH builds resilience with sanitation, it's all about health. We know that the safe capture and storage, transportation and treatment and disposal of fecal waste keeps people healthier, reduces their exposure, and therefore makes them more capable to cope with climate change. This is particularly true in places where women and girls are holding the caregiving brunt of the work for the household. If their family members get sick, even if they are lucky enough to be doing some work that can bring in actual income into the family, they're not going to be able to go to work. They're going to need to stay home and take care of their kids or their partner or whoever else in the family is sick. They're going to be trying to reach the healthcare facilities. Will the healthcare facilities have water? Will the healthcare facilities be able to take care of them? This is really critical questions. And of course, as Paul was talking about, hygiene, being able to keep and maintain hygiene behaviors, as we've seen with COVID, keep the disease down and reduce that exposure so people are healthier and better able to cope with climate change. I am a policy person, so you would expect my presentation to end with some recommendations. Governments and international organizations should focus on implementing low regrets adaptation solutions now, instead of waiting until mitigation is solved. And it was really exciting at COP26 to really feel like there's now momentum behind this, that we're not going to try to put all of our money and all of our efforts into reducing emissions and then get around to thinking about adapting to climate change. People are recognizing that climate change is already here, especially for those who are on the front lines of climate change, and we need to be implementing adaptation solutions for them now. And we should follow IPCC, and that should include water and sanitation services. Governments and international agencies need to integrate WASH and health considerations into their national climate policy responses, such as the nationally determined contribution. So Angola has some very beautiful language. If you want an example of the importance of WASH in their NDC that was released last summer, recommend reading that. And of course, as we've been talking a lot, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. And so we need the funding for the WASH services to be made available out of climate adaptation funding. I've got a final slide with some of the resources from WaterAid that we hope might be helpful to you looking at climate resilient WASH and our new report that's out on the foundation of strong resilient health systems. And I will say thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. So we are running a little late, but we're going to carry on with the next presenter and then move into the panel discussion. So we will run over a little bit into the allocated lunchtime, but I hope you'll stay with us and save your questions for the panel. So I'll introduce Judith Omasetti. She's a water, sanitation and hygiene consultant. She's also a graduate of UEA's MSc in Water Security and International Development. She's worked with international development, INGOs, for 20 years in Africa and in the UK. She currently works for Norwich City Council as a community conversation officer, promoting community development and resilience. She's a WASH consultant and recently carried out consultancies with WaterAid on WASH resilience and climate resilience for vulnerable communities, and climate change effects on drowning for RNLI, which is the basis of her talk today. She's also a British Red Cross Norfolk Emergency Response volunteer and is training to be a WASH delegate for the International Federation for the Red Cross Emergency Response Unit. So Judith is one of those people who really is at the forefront of community engagement and has a wealth of experience that she's bringing to her talk today. So over to you, Judy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here virtually and in the audience here. I'm not very good at presenting, so please just listen to the words. I usually hide behind research, so bear with me. So thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, RNLI, UEA Water Security Research, and University of Leicester. This is for a project we completed in March this year on understanding the impact of climate change on drowning risk in Bangladesh and Tanzania. Many people are unaware of RNLI's drowning risk reduction programs outside the UK. In Bangladesh, RNLI's risk reduction programs activities include community daycare for preschool children, survival swimming lessons for school-age children, and rescue and response training for key adults in communities. In Tanzania, it's safe boating training for fishers, co-designing buoyancy products, and strengthening fishers guidance to include occupational safety. Due to the high incidence of drowning in specific populations in these countries, the project sought to understand how climate change might impact the RNLI programs between now and 2040. Next slide, please. So we examined data from literature review, informal discussions with in-country experts, including WaterAid Tanzania and EMIDO, and secondary data analysis to examine the interaction of the projected implications of climate change with other risk dynamics. So for example, the graphs on the right are examples of our secondary data analysis derived from WHO Global Health Estimated data. Just to point out, for year 2000, there was 1,700 drowning deaths in Tanzania, and for Bangladesh was 21,000. So that's just an example. But I would also add, just as Jamie mentioned earlier about evidence, most of the literature review also mentioned that drowning deaths are really underreported. So take that information with a pinch of salt. Next, please. Next slide. Different tools for the projections or climate modeling were used, including IPCC reports, regional assessments, and also from the World Bank reports. However, again, these sources have limitations, including timescales of projected change not being consistent. However, there were direct and indirect impacts on how projected changes may translate into impacts via changes in mean conditions and extreme weather events. Also, key systematic changes to environment and society could potentially be triggered. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That was for the previous slide. Okay. So as you can see by the show of arrows, of the upward arrows, for both Bangladesh and Tanzania, show significant climatic changes by 2040. So when I refer to Bangladesh and Tanzania, this is by no means a comparison between the two countries. They've just been placed together because of the short time we have to given for the presentation. So they both show increases in average temperatures, which could lead to droughts, as Paul mentioned earlier, high intensity rainfall events, human exposure to river and coastal floods, and to intense cyclones is likely and possible in both countries. Also in Bangladesh, displacement from low-lying areas likely in the south due to sea level rise. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the demographic and economic trends and projections for both countries. And the projection indicate increase in population growth, which is higher in Tanzania between 2022 and 2050. And then it's projected to have high levels of currently there is high levels of multi-dimensional poverty, but declining in both countries. And also there is projected twofold increase in disaster-induced displacement for Bangladesh, and fivefold increase in disaster-induced displacements for Tanzania. Next slide, please. Here you can see a table of the key drowning risk factors we looked at using an interactive workshop to categorize risk factors into the broad themes and to qualitatively evaluate the likelihood of risk factors to increase and their consequence of drowning risks. So the red color indicates factors we considered very likely at almost certain to increase and which have high consequences for drowning risk. So we thought environmental, individual risk factors, social factors, occupational risk factors, and population level risk factors. So those were the themes that we looked at, and Catherine, you'll be pleased to see wash access was included there. Next slide, please. So using the qualitative exercise, using a risk assessment matrix to aid discussions of relative importance of climate change effects of drowning risks and program activities prior to, during, and after a workshop with RNLI staff and other experts. So this was, we had to do that online because it was during lockdown, and we had the Tanzania team and the Bangladesh team involved as well. So through this process of independent research, and the team offers a summary on plausible connections between climate change and drowning risk factors. Those considered most significant are shown as the proximal factors, which were the geographic proximity to water. There are also extreme weather events, and another was lack of supervision of children, fishing occupation, and then intermediate risk factors were underage children under age under 5, and then livelihood instability, and the contextual risk factors were degradation of resources, migration, and displacement. So I'll just expand on the lack of supervision for young children. Climate change is very likely to increase stresses on low-income families by exacerbating livelihood insecurity, increasing working hours, and increasing illness, injury, or death from poor safety and work practices combined with extreme weather effects. So any of these factors may reduce parental capacity to supervise young children and protect them from drowning risks. So we saw that in some of the literature review, the children were left with their grandparents, and they as well may not have the ability to physically, or maybe because of health conditions, could not as well look after the children. So that's adds to another risk. So we'll just move to the next slide, please. So, and we concluded that climate change should be factored into drowning risk reduction policies and interventions in both countries. The rationale for RNLI and their country partners and the ongoing projects need to continue, and impacts on some additional groups should be monitored. And also we concluded that a multi-sectoral and holistic approach is required. So I'll just expand on that. So when we talked about what RNLI was focusing was for Bangladesh was children under 5, and so with the day care centers. But we also looked at another age group that will be at risk is likely to be, we had people with disability, the elderly. Also, there were other factors that needed to be considered. So however much there's preparations for disasters like flooding, cyclones, there are cyclone centers, but were not the women did not go to the cyclone centers because it was not safe for them. So that's why we are talking about it being multi-sectorial. So for Tanzania, for example, we looked at the fishing community. So you find that the fishers, the regulations, the boating regulations are not really observed. And you also find that they do not have the banking system. So there is disposable money, and that also include, because they are a mobile community, it means that so from a cultural point of view, the norms that usually protect them around their name, so that's broken, and that means disposable cash. And also we looked at the fishing communities, how that links with the wash. So they use the lake to fetch water, and if the lake levels rise, that also causes another risk factor. And in terms of looking at the holistic approach, within the lake, for Tanzania, the communities around the lake, those living in the islands have a higher vulnerability than those living on mainland. And at the same time, because of we found that talking to the in-country experts, when there is an effect from drought, the people sort of migrate to live around the lakes. And so that brings another risk, because the people who are the newcomers, the migrants who've moved may not be aware of the weather conditions. And also because of the financial difficulties, people will want to go fishing when the weather is not conducive. So that's why we're talking about a holistic approach. Next slide, please. So we have key data sources from the literature review. Next slide, please. And the references. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so if I can invite our panel members to all take a seat at the front, Judy as well. And so Paul, can you pop down to join us at the front? And we'll take any questions from people in the audience, or if there are any questions online. Perhaps we'll start with the question online, if there is one.
Yes, from Becky Baines. She said and this is to Paul, so maybe I'll wait until he's ready.
Come on, Paul. Get down those stairs.
So Becky says the BBC News reported on heightened polio outbreaks in the London sewers yesterday, and she just wanted to know what your comments were on that.
Right, if she'd been watching the BBC yesterday, she would have known what my comments were. But yeah, essentially, I mean, wastewater monitoring for poliovirus is something that goes on pretty much globally, most countries. And the issue in London is that at times you do get vaccine-derived strains. There are two types of vaccine to polio. There's the inactivated vaccine, or dead vaccine, but don't tell a virologist I said it was dead, because we don't use that term for viruses. But a sort of inactivated virus that we use now, and that's an effective vaccine against polio. Some countries are still using a live vaccine, which works by actually causing an infection, but it doesn't cause the paralysis. And so in countries where you still use live vaccine, polio vaccine, you do occasionally get subsequent transmissions. And so essentially somebody from one of these countries will have come back while they were incubating or indeed shedding polio, and then infected a few others. Now it's spreading. I don't know how widely it's spreading at the moment. I don't know how many cases you need to actually be detecting it in the wastewater treatment plants. But it is so the vaccine-derived polio virus generally isn't that severe, and at the moment there have been no cases that have been diagnosed, and certainly no paralytic poliomyelitis. But the concern is that if that transmission cycle goes on for too long, the virus will evolve to once again full virulence and start causing paralytic poliomyelitis, which, if that happened, would be an absolute nightmare. And now, fortunately, most kids in this country, the vast majority of kids, are immunized against polio, so we wouldn't see anything like we saw back in the early part of the last century, where you had whole wards full of iron lungs with kids and teenagers and young adults stretched out in them for sometimes weeks on end, having their breathing managed for them. But you wouldn't need that many in cases for it to be still a public health disaster. So that's the concern. It's not an immediate threat, but if it goes on for too long, it could become a very serious threat to people who are not immunized. And some of these areas have got actually very low uptake of polio vaccine. Some of that low uptake currently, particularly with the boosters, is because of the restrictions that we've lived through, lockdowns, which have delayed childhood vaccination programs and school closures. And I think we just need to make sure that we boost that vaccines. Most of these events ultimately fizzle out of their own accord around the world, but you only need one that doesn't fizzle out to end up in a very difficult position, really.
And perhaps just add a little comment and see whether you agree, Paul, is that that's one of the possible consequences of climate change, extreme weather events on health services functioning. If childhood vaccination programs are interrupted, we may face more situations like this.
Particularly in low-income countries who struggle, particularly in low-income countries who are already struggling at times to maintain their childhood vaccination campaigns.
Thank you. I think we had a question in the audience.
Hi, thank you. I'm Declan Conway. I'm based in the Grantham Research Institute, but I was based at UEA for much of my career. My question is prompted by Jamie's presentation, which I really enjoyed, and I really enjoyed all four presentations. They were great, but it may be relevant for the rest of the panel. Jamie, you clearly had a long career with a foot in the policy arena and a foot in the academic research arena, and that gives you this very rich experience and insights into how we can overcome some of the barriers that might exist and approaches to that. And it just made me think about two questions. One is that are there career pathways that others can follow? That are there enough career pathways that enable people to get this cross-cutting experience and insight across science policy? And a second question is, because I'm based in a university myself, is thinking a little bit about, do we have enough incentive structures for academic researchers to engage in this type of work? So two questions, career pathways.
Okay, I'm just going to repeat those for those online. So the first question was, are there enough career pathways that support the policy science cross-cutting work? And what was the second question, Declan? Are there incentives for researchers to engage?
Are there enough incentives for university researchers to engage in this type of work?
Incentives for university researchers to engage in that cross-cutting conversations?
I think the answer's got to be more than just yes and no, hasn't it? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I didn't cover, because the presentation was broad and I was trying to cover a lot of ground, one of the things I didn't talk about is some of the specific roles that support that interface. Yeah. So we as practitioners, whether on the science or the decision-making side, can engage in some. There are certain functions which are normally exercised by third parties, and they're given the sort of clunky abbreviations or shorthand of knowledge broking and public entrepreneurship. So knowledge brokers are the people that are go-to third parties. In water and health, we might look, for example, to the International Water Association as an example. Actually, they'll come up as an example of two things, but they serve to make sense and deliver information into specific stakeholder groups. I mentioned those partly because they indicate another career path. Yeah, so you don't just need to be a scientist who thinks they want to try and influence policy or programming, or a policy or programmer who wants to use science. There are specialists who play those roles. Public entrepreneurship is mainly an institutional role, but that's an entity which runs with something. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to use IWA again as the example for that. But when WHO introduced its water safety plan ideas, IWA were there with them and bringing them to the water utility community and to communities of practice. So that's meant to respond to the question, are there career paths? I believe there are. Yeah. Your second question is, are there incentives? And I find that question quite interesting because in my mind, one of the greatest successes that one has in, for example, academia is by seeing one's findings picked up and used. And I can't imagine a much greater incentive than having impact. And we know that some of the research assessment exercises and similar now look for that uptake and use as a fundamental indicator of success. So I think that's that, yes. I think we're very weak at conceiving the things that can be done, and that we're very weak in helping individual scientists reflect on the things they can do to make their work more relevant. The example I gave was that early stage engagement where many scientists still are very reluctant to do it. It's sort of, it feels like corrupting the research enterprise, letting these strange other people know what we're up to. It's all a big private game that we play in an ivory tower. We've also undermined the notion of academic freedom. So more and more research is tied to specific funding streams. And I think that's been a strategic mistake, because some of the foresight that I talked about arrives from personal interactions, knowing people, finding something which is coming through and being able to work on it perhaps over a protracted time before it becomes recognized and funded. And I think that notion of academic freedom, though it sounds desperately old-fashioned, is something that we would be well guided to recover and enhance.
I just want to add a little bit to that and try to come from a different non-academic perspective. I'm also, as you can tell from my accent, American. So I just want to talk a little bit about my experience, right? So in the US, you are not encouraged to decide at the age of 16 what you will be doing when you're 52. And you are not, you don't have those concentrations that happen in your last 2 years before you go to university. I really like the academic American system. This is because I ended up finishing my first year and going, wow, I really like my international relation classes, but I'm doing really well in chemistry. I'll just double major because I think I want to do this thing that might be a thing called science policy, but I don't know anyone that's ever done it. And there's definitely not a major called this. So I'll just throw some things together and see how that works. And I'm happy to report that I've been able to do it. But I think it's also about giving people the freedom and the support to look for new jobs. And I think that when we look at the number of people that are coming out with PhDs, and yet many institutions still promote this very narrow view of, well, you've gotten your PhD, so now you need a postdoc, and then you're going to need another postdoc. And what you're going to need to do is have a very academic career, and that's what success looks like. Whereas actually, you might have some people who finish their undergraduate in a science degree, and they may go out and work for a company, and they may not use their science background. They are using their science background. They are thinking analytically. They're going into meetings and they're asking questions. And then if they say they work on communication, someone says, oh, this thing, they read the paper. Where's the evidence for that? Where does that come from? Oh, I know where I can look that up. And we really need science literate people in a variety of disciplines to get that message out there as well. So I think it's also about freeing up students as they look for job opportunities to say, you don't have to take this academic career path. There are lots of ways you can make a really big difference, and you can find that. And I think especially now that we've moved away from the kind of job security of you get a job and you know that you can be there for decades, we really need to open people's minds up to making career changes every 5 to 10 years if they need to.
All right, thank you. We have a question online and then one from the audience.
Yeah, this is a question from Duke Newbury. I can't speak now. For Jamie, but perhaps some of the other panelists would also like to comment. He asks, what suggestions do you have for keeping scientific evidence alive and relevant to decision makers when the principles have been around for a long time?
Who would like to answer that? It's to Jamie.
Well, I guess that puts me on the spot again, doesn't it? I'm not sure I properly understand the question. So could you say it again? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So he asks, what suggestions do you have for keeping scientific evidence alive and relevant to decision makers when the principles have been around for a long time? So I think he means sort of when specific.
So when the evidence
pieces
is
of
long
scientific-
standing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was thinking principles meaning people. So no. That's a really good question, and I'll be honest, not something I walked into the room having reflected on a great deal. If I look back for examples of what you're describing, I can certainly think, or the questioner is describing, I can certainly think of examples of failure where fads tend to dominate in action, and those fads override evidence. And that does suggest that there is an important role in making sure that we keep old evidence up to date. And I'm rather a fan with my own students. I talk a great deal about not just using the most recent reference, go back, understand where these ideas came from. So what can we do? One of the things that we rely on a great deal now is review articles, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and so on. And I think they provide a mechanism to update, but continue to honour older evidence. That's one practical thing. Another thing is, frankly, I think in teaching of science, we fall into the trap of the new a great deal. And I think reminding people of the history and the origins of some of our knowledge and how that relates to contemporary insights is really important. When we were talking about nature-based solutions earlier, it struck me, well, is a slow sand filter a nature-based solution? Because it's using nature as a machine to solve societal problems, which seem to be what Dave was describing. So there's two ideas. I don't know if anyone else wants to cover on principles that are still alive. Dread to think of dead principles. That would be a consequence of climate change, wouldn't it?
Thanks, Jamie. So I think we have another question from Mark.
Hello, Mark Zaytoun from School of International Development and also the Director General of the Geneva Water Hub, which operates at the interface of science and policy. So I have two questions, if I may, unrelated. The first to Jamie, just asking you to elaborate on what you touched upon at the very end of your presentation, which was all the special interests and the dynamics which influence the use of evidence and knowledge, understanding that evidence isn't quite enough, and understanding that when it turns into knowledge, it's very interested no matter what, particularly in this day and age when there's an overload of information as opposed to evidence and as opposed to knowledge, and disinformation and what we perceive as disinformation. So I'd just like you to elaborate on where, appreciating the past and the importance of the traditional method in this current world and where we're going in the next 10 years, expecting more disinformation. Second, unrelated question would be to Paul and to Catherine. I thought I saw, I'm wondering if the incidence of cholera increases with increasing temperature or not. And I thought I saw that there was no evidence in when Paul presented, and there was a paper that Catherine referred to that there is evidence of that. I assume it's methodological issues, but down to methodological issues, or I misunderstood. So I'd just like you to clarify that, if you may.
Okay, so we have two questions. Is Paul and Catherine going to answer first? Okay.
The thing with, cholera, temperature does impact on cholera. And one of the ways that cholera overwinters in many ways is in brackish waters, estuarine waters. That's because cholera, the Vibrio tend to prefer slightly more salty waters, but not ocean level saltiness to grow. And they don't really grow well over cold months, but during warmer months, they can start regrowing in the body. Once they then start spreading in human society, then the sort of the temperature issues are probably less relevant, but certainly as a way of jumping from one epidemic to another, temperature can have a big impact on cholera. And also actually on the growth, sometimes cholera, the Vibrios, they live on some of the sort of the plankton in waters, and so those are also ultimately affected by temperature. So yeah, temperature does have an impact. And you know, I, as you probably gathered, I was trying to sort of just highlight one or two things rather than go into something that, as we've talked about in the past, could well go into a 2 years master's. Yeah, but no, it's right. Anyway. Okay. Okay.
Thanks. I guess I misunderstood.
Could you just concisely repeat Mark's question?
So your first question, which you were dealing with second, was, and allow me to paraphrase, essentially, what's the role of evidence in a post-truth society? So you were challenging me, you know, I made this rather glib throwaway right near the end. And I confess it really was a note that there's something really important happening. And it's not something that I've got a highly structured or evidence-driven response to. There is a simple fact that there is a significant and very vocal proportion of our population worldwide now, which simply doesn't believe in facts and truth in the way that most of us, I think, in this room probably do. That they're mutable things, and they're things that can be held by different people in different positions because of values or just because they can exist in parallel with one another. I don't know the answer to that. I know it's happening. I know it worries me. One of the things that I see as a response to it, which worries me equally, is dismissiveness of those who adopt those positions. I can only say this from opinion, not from evidence, but despite what sometimes we see as the absurdity and the annoyingness of unfounded contrary positions, what I have seen convinces me that the one thing we, the big we, can do in response to that is to remain engaged, to listen, to recognize and hear a position and calmly outline the contrary position. Why am I emphasizing that? Because one of the things I try and do to remind myself of what the world is like around me is to drift into sort of chats and things that I wouldn't normally engage in. I find some of what I read absolutely appalling and terrifying. But that comes from both sides. It becomes this very vitriolic back and forth, and I think alienating and polarizing populations is not helping in winning the middle ground.
Thank you, Jamie. Any comments from the other panelists on that?
I mean, I think it's very clear that disinformation has played a big role in the COVID pandemic, but it's played big roles in pretty much every major infectious disease pandemic, epidemic that we've had since for well over 100 years ago. During the Spanish flu in 1918, there were people arguing about face masks not being God's will and things like that. And I 2 years ago, we published a paper purely by chance on misinformation in Ebola outbreaks, norovirus outbreaks, and monkeypox outbreaks, and that by chance appeared virtually on the same day that the Director General of the UN raised concerns about disinformation sharing in the pandemic. And I think all you can do is continue to reiterate what you see as the truth, and say that as clearly and as calmly as you can. I think getting into debates with either extremes, and there have been extremes on both sides of the sort of the COVID pandemic, often is futile in terms of actually changing opinions of the people expressing those. But as long as you maintain a calm and careful, balanced approach to sharing what you believe to be the truth, then I think that's what every scientist should be doing, really. But yeah, I mean, it's been hard dealing with some of the extremes and the people with extreme views on either side of the COVID debate, it must be said.
Can I add something, Joe? Because this is listening to what Paul was saying reminded me of one other thing that I recognise and have seen. So the response, Mark, would be one thing we can all do is always be self-critical, and to hear what is being said to the extent of asking ourselves, is there something in there? Because it's very easy for our preconceptions about what the evidence is to force us to block things out. Now, I think this is unusual, but it does happen. Sometimes we need to accept we can be wrong and rethink things. And there are preconceptions. I've come across preconceptions about what works, where scientists have been so adamant about this is the intervention that delivers this, to the point where even when the evidence is flowing into the contrary, that evidence is being rejected. So as a good scientist, whether you're a science user or a science producer, being self-critical, listening to objections and making sure that your rejection of them is sound is actually really important.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, I think if unless there's any burning questions from the audience, and I think there are no more online, what I'm going to do now is thank the panelists, but hand over to Robert, who's going to say a few closing comments, and then we'll head off to lunch.
Well, yeah, thanks to the panel in. So, and thank you all and everybody online who's, all the speakers, all the audience, both in person and virtual, because I think it's been a great sort of day meeting. I mean, I think you can feel the buzz in the room, actually. I mean, I think we were as the organizers, we were a little bit nervous at times before this meeting, and it's gone extremely well. So, I mean, we're all very, very pleased. And I think we've heard a great diversity of talks, lots of stimulating ideas and thoughts. Again, it's sort of post-COVID. It's nice to come together. It's not the first time I've been in the setting like this since COVID, but it's one of the first. And I think, it's a networking opportunity. And I think this exchange, you can see the value really online is great, but it's very nice to come together in the room and really talk about things face to face. And I sort of, in a way, it's a networking opportunity. Lots of ideas have emerged. And I think in a way I was thinking, well, what do I take away from this myself? And I think, well, I've heard lots of different ideas influencing my thinking. OpenClim was a project that got mentioned once or twice, which I'm involved in. So we're taking some of that back to that particular project. And maybe I challenge all of you to think, what's the one thing you heard over the last 24 hours you might take through to your work? I mean, there's lots of ideas, but pick one thing maybe and try and do something with it. Rebecca Osborne has been sort of capturing the work as a sort of graphic recording of the conference. So if you haven't seen the work, please have a look at that outside. So we'll have that record and that will be put online. Also, in terms of where we go from this, I mean, I think as an organizing group, we'll have as it's been successful, we'll have a think about what we might do after this. We're working on a piece for the conversation based on the discipline hopping work that kind of led to this conference. And I think we'll try and link that to this conference and maybe be in touch with the speakers to think about how we might facilitate that. And maybe there are other ways we can go forward. That'll depend on you guys as much as us, of course, because it's going to be a two-way thing. So thank you all very much, and continue the conversation outside. There's lunch, so plenty of time for talking. And we look forward to sort of being in touch in the near future with all of you. Thank you very much.